Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see third part, what if Deku became Spider-Man after a science experiment. Here is short summary. A single encounter can change the course of history. When Izuku Midoriya tried and failed to pass the UA practical exam, his despair knew no boundaries. However, when he comes across a child in need, his fate would be forever changed, as the encounter leads him to become the science experiment of a deranged doctor, and grants him the abilities to become a hero. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Deku General Hospital was well known for its service and care of its patients. It was also very well funded by many notable agencies around the country. As such, the doctors and nurses working there were very well paid, and more so respected. It was the leading hospital that made use of medicines that were rooted within quirks. It was also a well-known fact that the hospital was partnered with many nursing homes and orphanages. However, just below the surface, the welcoming facade of the hospital gave way to something far more sinister. Deep below the ground lay a secret that no one knew about save for a very select few. The underground facility was host to the lab of one Dr. Kyudai Garaki, sometimes known as Dr. Tsubasa, when he was working incognito. That being said, the man had no morals whatsoever whenever it came to his life's work. And that life's work was the study and advancement of quirks, by any means necessary. Recently, however, those endeavors had proven fruitless when he had joined in on an attack against UA High School. For the deranged doctor, such a place was a bountiful field full of ripe fruits ready for the picking. Yet, when he attempted to harvest said fruits, not only had he fallen short, but his children had also been destroyed in the process. Currently, the doctor was sitting at his desk below the hospital analyzing the one sample he had managed to acquire. How curious, he mumbled to himself while he went over the results. This quirk may be slightly more interesting than I believed. He smiled before he typed something down on his data pad, a mix of elasticity and strength augmentation. Not a partial gigantification quirk at all. A window popped up on his computer. Doctor, I believe that I left instructions so that I would not be disturbed. The man asked in a bored tone while addressing the nurse. The woman nodded from her side of the screen. Yes, sir, I realize that, but I have one of your special patients on line number 3. She said while the doctor gave her a perplexing look. He assured me that it was quite urgent, sir, or else I wouldn't have bothered you. Kyudai gave a deep, frustrated sigh. Very well, forward it to my personal line here, please, he said, and picked up a landline phone from his desk. Hello. Dr. Garaki speaking. Hey, Doc. Kyudai recognized that voice. It's Wolfram. Sorry to bother you, but I've got a little problem. The rotund man chuckled in his throat. Oh ho. Something wrong with the strength-enhancing quirk? He asked, knowing full and well that his work on the mercenary was perfect. No, it's not me, Wolfram said. You remember those reports of a guy that had a powerful weather-manipulating quirk? The doctor stiffened. I do, indeed, my boy, he said, his interest piqued. Are you saying that you know where I can find him? I'm saying that I'm working with him, Wolfram corrected him, catching the doctor's interest completely. The guy came to me not too long ago with a couple of others. He went on, Kyudai practically salivating. We did a few jobs together, and I like the guy. He's driven. The doctor hummed. I sense a bit in here somewhere, my boy, Kyudai said while reaching up to twirl his mustache. What aren't you telling me, Wolfram? Wolfram sighed over the phone, creating a static sound. The guy's sick, Doc, Wolfram went on. I haven't heard of anyone this sick in a long time, not since the Devil's Breath incident. Oh, dear, the man said quietly. You need me to treat him? Yeah, I owe him, Wolfram said, but I'll make good on it. You know I will, he said hastily, fearing the man's ire. The doctor merely chuckled. My boy, you needn't worry, he said, his voice as smooth as a snake's skin. You know the usual routine. I'll let my special staff know about your arrival. As soon as you've brought him in, and I've figured out what the problem is, then we can talk about payments. Wolfram was quiet for a moment, Then he heard the mercenary chuckle. You know, Doc, his friends have some pretty nice, unique quirks. You hear me knocking? Kyudai chuckled. I certainly do, my boy, and I'm inclined to let you in. His smile grew impossibly wide, and speaking of quirks, his glasses glinted brightly in the dim light of his laboratory. I think I already have a way for you to repay my services. That's so, Wolfram said. What are we talking about here, Doc? Murder, robbery. Nothing so grand, my boy, he said. You see, I recently found a few interesting prospects, you might say. He continued, however, I was thwarted in harvesting any of their quirks. Ah, so we're talking about kidnapping, huh? Wolfram asked with a laugh on his end. I can do that, but it might take some time. The doctor chuckled. Not to worry, it's nothing as grand as that, either. He sighed. Either way, when things are ready, I will ask you to help me obtain some samples, at the very least. I can do that, Doc, Wolfram said. You just have to give me some names. Kyudai chuckled again and plucked at his mustache. The first one I have interest in, all of them, really, are students or wards of UA. He heard Wolfram hiss over the line. Shit, Doc, that wasn't you that hit the school recently, was it? I'm afraid so, my boy, the doctor sighed. I was involved with an impatient man-child that my, shall we say benefactor, insisted that I care for. He said, picking up a newspaper with an article over the entire fiasco. As you can probably tell from today's paper, the assault went rather poorly. Poorly would be an understatement. Doc, Wolfram laughed. I've had my boys casing most of the security systems used by I-Island, and Tartarus, and UA just upgraded their security to the same level. The doctor groaned loudly. Now, Doc, don't get upset. I didn't say it was impossible. Just delicate. Kyudai sighed. You are admittedly good at your job, Wolfram, the doctor sighed, but I believe even you would have trouble with such a security system. Wolfram chuckled on his end. Now, don't go underestimating me, Doc, he chuckled. Don't forget, I've pulled jobs that even S.H.I.E.L.D. can't pin on me. UA, nurse's office. How are you feeling, young man? Recovery girl asked as Izuku flexed his arms and legs before he patted down his ribs. Any lingering pains or discomforts? Izuku smiled at the elderly nurse and shook his head. No, I feel like I'm back in fighting shape, he said before looking over his shoulder at Hononuki. How's the arm, Juzo? The teen flexed the freshly healed arm and nodded. Never better. He said, I'll be glad to get back to the dorms, and enjoy the rest of our week off. Recovery girl huffed. You're acting like you've been in here for just as long when it's only been 2 days, she groused before turning back to Izuku. Now, I still want you to take it easy on yourself. You were badly beaten after all, and while your healing abilities may have set you right, you really should think about that visit to Hound Dog. The boy nodded. Don't worry, Miss Recovery Girl, he sighed and hung his head. Kyoka won't let me bow out of it, anyway. The nurse gave the boy a nod. At least you found someone that has a good head on her shoulders for such a young age. She said, giving the boy a hard look, and you should keep a very close eye on little Eri. Izuku looked at her in alarm. She's traumatized, my boy, that's easy to see. She reminded him, and if what I've heard about her treatment has any truth to it, then she's been conditioned to blame herself whenever harm comes to someone she cares about. She pointed the tip of her cane at him. And that includes the person she calls her father. Izuku nodded, knowing that the little girl needed more attention than he could ever give, in or out of school. Hey, Juzo spoke up behind him, why not take her out to an amusement park? He asked with a huge grin. Didn't you and Kyoka talk about that? She's being hunted, dearie, Recovery Girl reminded him, shaking her head. While I'd love to see you and the girl leave the grounds to let her see that the world isn't as dark a place as she's been made to believe, as long as those monsters are still on the loose, then I'd advise against it. Izuku sighed, which is why I'm hoping that the sports festival will solve that little problem, the boy said, at least for now, he sighed. Recovery Girl patted his arm. Now, chin up, dearie, she said, you're doing something that not many young men your age would do. She said with a soft smile, and that little girl is all the better for it, believe me. Izuku smiled at her. Hey, how's Hagakure doing? Aside from the migraine, Recovery Girl asked with a soft chuckle. I've had to be called away several times already to make her stop practicing that new aspect of her quirk. She said, giving the boy a slant-eyed look, you might want to keep on your toes. She's definitely going to want your advice on how to make use of it. I'll keep that in mind, he said as he rose and headed for the door. Thanks for taking care of me, Recovery Girl. She gave a short nod and smiled at the boy. Just make sure that you don't make visits to my office a habit, she said with a wave goodbye in his direction before turning back toward Hononuki. Now, then, dearie, let's have a look at your back before I give you the go-ahead. Izuku chuckled as Hononuki started undoing his bandages while he left the nurse's office. Heya, freshman, a voice called out as he closed the door behind him. He turned and saw Mirio and 2 other third years coming toward him. The old lady finally let you out. I heard that, Tagata. Recovery Girl called out from her office. The girl behind him giggled. Ooh, you are so busted, Mirio. She laughed as she patted his back and looked at Izuku with a bright smile on her face. So hey, I heard that you and the other freshmen got into a really bad fight the day before yesterday. She skipped forward, making the boy yelp at her forward behavior. So how did fighting all those villains feel? Did you beat any of them up? You were in the nurse's office for a while, so that means you got beat up, too, and… The other boy placed his hand over her mouth. Najire, you're freaking him out, the boy said timidly. Sorry about her, Mr. Freshman, she gets a little… ew. He took his hand away. You licked me. Najire smiled at him with her tongue sticking out. Yup. Anyway, Mirio cut in with a look at the younger teen. How are you holding up? He asked with an anxious look on his face. I heard an abridged version of what you had to go through from some gossip. Izuku shrugged. Kyoka and everyone else thinks I should visit Hound Dog, he said, beginning to think that it might be a good idea. Other than that, I'm physically fine. Mirio breathed a sigh of relief. That's good to hear. He smiled at him, then became serious. There was something else I wanted to tell you, too. Sir Night-Eye has a plan to raid the Yakuza's hideout in the next day or so. Mirio saw the boy's face light up. Normally it'd be all hands on deck for something like this, but Sir's thinking that a small group of pros and small army of police will be enough. I hope it'll be enough. Izuku nodded, and I hope that it all goes as planned. His thoughts turned to the little girl waiting for him back at their home. Ares suffered enough as it is without being trapped here. Mirio reached out and grasped his shoulder. She's not the only one. Midoriya, the older boy's face looked troubled. I may not know the full story, but I do know that you were beaten up pretty badly by those villains. He gained an understanding smile across his face. If you ever need to talk to someone, come look me up. Yeah, he's right. Najire said, you ever need an ear, we're always ready. She grinned widely, or if you need to talk. I'm really good at talking. The other boy, though he looked nervous, nodded. Why yeah, what they said. Izuku smiled at them. Thanks a lot, guys, he said, I'd better get home. Ares probably still scared, and I know Kyoka wants to talk. Najire looked at him. Do you mean that girl with the punk rocker theme going on? He gave the motor-mouthed girl a nod. I think I saw her heading to Hound Dog's office a few minutes ago. She gained a worried look across her face. She looked a little scared, maybe. Izuku nodded, and changed directions. Thanks, I guess I'll see them first, he said as he started down the hall. I'll see you guys later. Mirio and his friends frowned after him, the blonde teen placing his hands on his hips as watched his junior go. Man, talk about a rough first few days, huh? He asked his friends. Najire nodded slowly. I mean, the kid's basically doing pro work right off the bat. I don't know, Tagata, the boy, Amajiki, said. He seems pretty okay with everything that happened. Mirio sighed. Yeah, and that's what worries me. Guidance counselor's office. Kyoka found herself feeling nervous as she sat across from the large canine human mutant that was Hound Dog. The muzzle didn't help, but the way the counselor spoke seemed to put her at ease. There's no need to feel nervous, Miss Jiro, he said in a soft and gentle tone. If you don't feel comfortable with any of my questions, then you don't have to answer them, and we can change the subject if you want, all right? Yes, sir, she said, her voice still rich with nerves. Hound Dog wrote something down in his book. Let's start off with something simple, he offered, your relationship with Mr. Midoriya. Do you feel comfortable with the subject? Hyoka nodded, not speaking. The way her jacks were floating around her head gave the canine teacher an odd feeling of nervousness. All right then, he smiled beneath his muzzle. How long have you two been official? Hyoka shook her head. Not long, she said, thinking back on the day of the battle trial. I honestly didn't see it coming. How so? Hound Dog asked. Did you not like him? Hyoka shook her head. No, it's not like that, she said. Well, I'm not the kind of girl that makes moves on someone, but I did, and I never expected it to pay off. She admitted, and when I did, everyone seemed so happy for us. May I ask what prompted you to make a move on Midoriya? He asked, seeing her cheeks turn red. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. I don't mind, it's just embarrassing, she muttered. Hound Dog chuckled. Nothing that's said here will ever leave this room, you have my word on that. He promised. I won't even inform your parents unless it is absolutely necessary. Hyoka sighed and made a half-hearted gesture to herself. When I was in middle school, I was always comparing myself to other girls, she said. I mean when I see a girl my age walking down the hall with one of those bouncing chests, and on the arm of a really nice boy. I always thought, why can't that be me? She shivered, and when we started our first day here, I walked in the classroom right behind Izuku, and every girl in the class was totally the opposite of me. And how does Midoriya feel about your appearance? He asked. I will readily admit that with what I've heard of the boy, he doesn't seem the type to judge people on how they look. Hyoka had to smile at that. He's not, she shook her head. He's told me as much, but that didn't stop me from feeling inferior to the other girls when they started taking notice of him. And what was it that pushed you over the edge, so to speak? Hound Dog asked. Hyoka shrugged. Well, before we made it to school, Izuku had to fight off one of the Yakuza's lapdogs, in full costume, she said with a slight tremor running through. Izuku wears baggy clothes all the time, so you wouldn't know just how muscular he is, but the costume that Mr. Yagi gave him showed just how much his clothes hid. Her face was as red as an apple by now, so, when we started classes, the other girls. They took notice right away, and you felt threatened, Hound Dog said, causing her to look down in shame. There's nothing wrong with that, Miss Jiro. There's no doubt that if you and Mr. Midoriya didn't already have a bond, then one of the other girls would have made a bid for him by now. He said before writing a few more things down in his book. If you don't mind my asking, what was it that really made you go for him? It was something that Hagakure and Ashido said just before our first combat training class with All Might, she sighed, remembering that day with slight embarrassment. When Izuku walked out in his costume, no one seemed to recognize him besides me and Eri. Ashido said that he was really intimidating, and Hagakure agreed, but she also thought that it was hot, which annoyed me so much, so before he went in for his team's turn, I sorta gave him a good luck beep on the mask where his mouth was. As she feared, Hound Dog laughed. But it wasn't mocking or obnoxious, but a good-humored chuckle. I'll be willing to bet that he was quite taken by surprise. Hyoka nodded slowly. There's absolutely no shame in any of the steps you took, especially seeing as Mr. Midoriya seems to reciprocate your feelings. The girl shrugged. I got lucky. She muttered quietly. Now that's not true. Hound Dog smiled. True that luck had a great deal to do with your current situation, but when looking at the two of you, it's quite easy to see that he feels the same way about you. Hyoka gave a small smile, her eyes downcast. Now, let's bring something else to light, little Eri. Hyoka looked at him, her eyes growing cold. What about her? Seeing the girl's change in demeanor, the counselor shook his head. I don't mean that you're doing a bad job about raising her, Hound Dog said, far from it. From what I've been able to observe through the school's camera, she's a bright, happy and, shall we say, healing child. He offered. I was able to watch the video footage we have of her when she's been seen on campus with you and Mr. Midoriya, and I think you're doing very well with her. Then what's there to talk about? Hyoka asked. I don't mind being her mother. Hound Dog gave a sigh. I'm sure that you don't. At least, not right now. You don't. She gave him a harsh glare. What I mean to say is, and this is completely hypothetical, that there may come a time when you and Mr. Midoriya separate. How do you think that will affect Eri? Kyoka bit her lip. She had thought about that, several times in fact. Then she looked down at the ring on her finger. Families don't always stay together, I'll admit that, the girl said, but that doesn't mean they stop being family. Hound Dog jotted something down and closed the book. I think that will do with my concerns about her, for now, but keep what you just said in mind, Miss Jiro. He said before lacing his fingers together. I'll end this session with one last question. After the incident at the USJ, how did you feel? What do you mean? She asked. Hound Dog took a deep breath. I realized that what happened the other day could mean a lot of things for someone so young, but you went through several things, he said. Not only did you come face to face with a threat that you were ill-prepared to deal with, but your daughter was turned into a target, and you were forced to watch as your boyfriend was tortured. The counselor said, seeing that the girl had gone several shades paler. Kyoka hugged herself, her shoulders hunched. What do you expect me to say? She asked. When the attack started, Izuku and I had Eri in our arms, but that mist villain's quirk just took her from us. She muttered, though with Hound Dog's enhanced hearing, he could easily catch what she was saying. Then I get thrown across the training area into a bunch of villains ready to tear me to pieces. If it wasn't for Mei and Yaomomo, I probably wouldn't be here. Even if I cranked my choker's volume up to lethal levels. Were you prepared to do such a thing? Hound Dog asked, slightly surprised that she'd brought the subject he'd been holding back into the conversation herself. Kyoka found herself nodding. I was, she said, I was ready to do it in a heartbeat. She trembled, because those villains weren't just there to beat or humiliate us, they were there to kill us. And did that bother you? Hound Dog asked. That you were prepared to kill. The girl sat back with a sigh and placed her hands in her lap, unconsciously twisting the ring on her finger. Not as much as I thought it would, she admitted, a pit growing in her stomach. I was terrified, not just for me, but for Eri and Izuku, too. I knew Izuku could handle himself to some extent, but Eri was defenseless. If Hagakure and Kendo hadn't gotten to her, then I doubt I'd. Her throat constricted on a sob. Hound Dog reached for a box of tissues on his desk and handed them to her. She knew better than to question it. She could feel the beginnings of tears forming in her eyes. Do you feel like you can continue? She nodded slowly as she dabbed at her eyes. I think so. When you're ready, then. Hound Dog said patiently. Kyoka took a moment to bring herself back under control. It wouldn't do her any good to keep falling apart in front of the hero. Still, she wished that she had waited until Izuku could join her so she could at least hold on to his hand. And then, just like magic, a knock came to the door. Come in. Hound Dog barked, pun very much intended. A moment of hesitation, and in walked Izuku. She had never felt so relieved in her entire life. Excuse me, Mr. Hound Dog, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. Please come in, Hound Dog said. I was just wondering when I'd get to see you. But he needn't have offered as the boy was already moving across the room. His attention was completely on her when he reached her. Without any hesitation, Kyoka reached out for his hand, her fingers lacing through his. The pit that had been forming seemed to disappear as soon as she did. Are you okay? He asked, probably seeing the remnants of the tears in her eyes. She'll be fine after some quality time with you and Eri, I think, Hound Dog said as the boy turned to him, and if you'll answer the same question that put her in this state, I think we'll end this session. He offered and Izuku gave a curt nod. After the incident at the USJ, how did you feel? Izuku thought for a moment, trying to find just the right word before giving the man a look. Inadequate. Hound Dog's ears perked up. How so? He asked curiously. I let myself get carried away by my emotions, Izuku said. I had started to form a plan to get my classmates out of the shipwreck zone, but when I picked up the signal from Ares' tracker in my mosque's sensor, all of that went out the window, and I lost control. He frowned. I left them behind, and just let loose on my bioelectrical powers, and electrified the water. The villains were knocked out, some even in critical condition, but I didn't care. All I cared about was getting to my daughter. Damn anyone that got in my way. And when you reached her? Hound Dog asked. My head cleared somewhat knowing that Kendo and Juzo were protecting her, he said, but shook his head. But I still left my classmates, my comrades behind. His free hand clenched tight enough that Kyoka could hear the bones in his knuckles groan, and I still needed Juzo's help to take down the villain we faced. He looked up at Hound Dog, and it took everything I had to hold myself back from breaking every bone in his body. And then you were taken by surprise by one of those hulking mutants the villains had brought along as an attack dog, Hound Dog stated. I won't ask how being treated as you were felt. Your wounds are still too fresh for that. Like I said, Izuku said quietly, inadequate. He looked down at his girlfriend. Are you ready to go? She nodded. If Hound Dog's done with me, she said with a look in the hero's direction. Hound Dog gave a short nod. It's fine, he said gently, but I would like to see you both back here again, and soon. He gave Izuku a pointed look. I've been told that you and I have much to discuss. Izuku sighed. Just tell me when. Hound Dog nodded. I expect you both back here on Friday, in the afternoon, 4 o'clock sharp. He said, in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your week off. Thanks, I'm sure we will. Izuku smiled as Kyoka stood up next to him and walked to the door arm in arm. As soon as the door closed behind them, he turned to her and said, I'm so sorry that I wasn't with you. She stood up on her toes and beeped him. You came when I needed you, that's all that matters. She gave his arm a tug. Come on. My mom and dad are watching Eri right now while your mom's at the hospital with your dad. How is he? Izuku asked. Kyoka shrugged as they began walking the halls. Last I heard the doctors were working on reconstructing his face with as many healing quirks as they could find. She said, Inko's been worried sick about you, though, so you'd better give her a call when we get home. Izuku chuckled. All right, I will. He smiled at her. Seriously, though, are you okay? She sighed with a tired smile on her face. I will be. She said, Hound Dog just gave me a lot to think about. Like, Izuku nudged her. Come on, you know I won't get upset. You might. This time, she frowned. He asked about us, like if this thing we have doesn't last, and how that would affect Eri. Izuku stopped dead in his tracks. How could, though it didn't show on the outside, she could hear his heartbeat increase rapidly. He was furious. His green eyes had a spark of electricity behind them. I don't want to break up with you, he said firmly. Not now, not ever, if you can put up with me. He ended on one of those crooked smiles of his, only to have one of Kyoka's jacks jabbed at his face. Hey, I don't plan on breaking things off either, Greenie, Kyoka told him, though she held a brilliant smile on her face, but you don't even know if you love me, yet, so. Izuku grinned at her, and pulled her against his chest. That isn't exactly what I said. He smiled at the blush on her cheeks. I said that I didn't know what love was, so I wasn't ready to say it. Her heart leapt right up into her throat. But that was before the attack on the USJ, the boy told her. Every thought that I had running through my head during the attack was about getting to you and Eri before something bad happened. He laughed. Then I get to see you standing over me like an angel, he said, shaking his head. If that's not love, then I don't know what is. Kyoka almost sputtered, but managed to hold herself together. You know, you've gotten pretty confident lately, Green Bean. She pushed off of his chest and tugged him back down the hall, even without your mask on. I think I can put the blame for a lot of that on you. The second that Izuku walked through the Jiro's door he was almost knocked off of his feet when Eri came flying at him like a tiny missile. Mika and Kyotoku were glad to see the boy back on his feet again, while their daughter seemed to be in a better mood than when she had left the nurse's office the day before. Kyoka, however, surprised both parents by stating that she was staying over at the Midoriya home that evening, claiming it was for Eri's sake. Her father wanted to make a fuss over it, but was silenced almost immediately by Mika's jacks hitting him in the back of his head. Before she left for next door, her mother caught up with her at the door. Kyoka, dear, I know that you've been stressed lately, but if you're thinking of. Kyoka blushed at the implications her mother was giving her. Mom, the girl gave her a look. That's not what this is about. The girl said with a firm tone, I'm just staying over because Eri needs me. Mika didn't quite believe her, and handed her something. It turned out, to Kyoka's mortification, to be a condom. Just humor me, please, dear. Her mother begged before her daughter could freak out. Kyoka turned on her heel, shoving the packet into her jean pocket, and followed after her boyfriend, intent on pretending that what just transpired never did. The rest of the day went as she had hoped, spending time with her boyfriend and the little girl they both adored. Relaxing, playing games and watching her draw pictures. They ended the evening by watching a movie on the couch with Eri cuddled up between them. It wasn't even midway through the film before the little girl was dozing off. When Kyoka Jack tapped him on the arm and pointed to the little girl, the boy smiled and gingerly lifted her from the couch. Eri mumbled sleepily while he carried her to her room. She got ahead of him and pulled the covers back so that he could lay her down. "Daddy," Eri mumbled, still half asleep. Izuku smiled down at her. "Right here, sweetie." Eri looked up at him with a small amount of fear in her little red eyes. "Those bad people won't come back anymore, will they?" "Oh honey." Kyoka sat on the edge of the bed, reaching up to brush her hair with the back of her hand. "You don't have to worry about them," she promised her with a smile on her face. "Daddy and Grandpa took them all to jail." Izuku chuckled at her little story. "Mommy's right, the bad people are all gone." He leaned over and beeped her head next to her horn. "They won't hurt us ever again. Promise." "I promise." Izuku smiled at her. "No one's ever gonna hurt you again." Kyoka got up and pulled the blankets over her. "You're safe and sound, baby," she said and pressed a soft beep to her forehead. Eri looked at her. "I don't want you and Daddy to get hurt because of me." The two pseudo-parents shared a look, and then Izuku knelt down and leaned on the edge of the bed. "Look at me, Eri," he said softly. "I can't promise that I won't get hurt," he told her, casting a small glance at his girlfriend, signifying that he was speaking to her as well. "I'm going to be a hero someday, and so is Mommy," he smiled, "and that means that I am gonna get hurt sometimes." Eri frowned, pulling the blankets up under her chin. "Do you have to?" He gave her a small nod. "It's my dream, Eri," he told her, reaching out and caressing her head. "And aside from being your dad, and Mommy's," he looked at Kyoka with a small blush, "well, besides being with you both, there's nothing that I want more," Izuku said with a shrug. "I can't really avoid it." He looked up at his girlfriend again. "But if I have the power to help people, then I'll do it, even if I have a chance of getting hurt." "But what if the bad people find me?" Eri asked with a small tremble in her voice while the barest hint of tears came to the corners of her eyes. Kyoka knelt down next to Izuku. "Then we'd fight them, Eri," the little girl whimpered, "because we both love you so much. And that right there is worth giving it our all to keep you safe." Izuku stepped in. "No matter who tries to hurt you, or Mommy, I'd fight for you both." He smiled at Kyoka, "Because that's how much I love you." Kyoka felt her heart absolutely melt. "So would I," she smiled, choking down a sob. Before the dam broke, she leaned over and beeped Eri's cheek. "Good night, Eri. Sleep tight." "Good night," Eri said as she began to nod off again. When she dropped off to sleep, Izuku turned her night light on while Kyoka turned out the overhead lights. Izuku followed her out of the room quietly, closing the door to just barely a crack. When he turned back to his girlfriend, she wrapped her arms around his neck and hauled him down for a blistering beat that sent a jolt all the way down to his toes. He barely had time to react before her hands raked into his hair, but he managed to collect himself enough to respond. They beeped each other deeply, both holding each other tightly as though they might disappear at any given moment when they both gasped as they separated, breathing heavily. What was that for?" Kyoka giggled breathlessly. "You have to ask." She laughed at the dazed look he had on his face. When his face reddened, she laughed even harder before tugging him over to the couch. "Come on, Romeo, let's finish the movie." They returned to the couch, though neither of them paid any attention to the movie. The door to Nezu's office came open abruptly, the sudden entry almost making the principal's fur stand on end. But having keener senses than a human, he was able to hear his visitor coming before he even entered the room. "It's good to see you back on your feet, Mr. Midoriya," he said in a way of greeting to the man, whose face was covered in bandages. "I see that the doctors were able to reconstruct your face properly." "Cut the niceties," Hisashi Midoriya snapped, striding to the mammal's desk to lean over the creature. "You had to have known what was going on." He slammed his hands down on the desk. My wife and son are only here because they were assured that they would be safe from harm. Nezu. He leered at him through his bandages, yet not even a full week has passed by, and we have had a breach in security, and then a day later, a horde of villains just marches right in. Flames spouted from his mouth, burning the strips of bandages around his mouth. So, explain it to me, how did this happen? Nezu sighed. I completely understand your ire, he said, gesturing for the man to sit, but he remained leaned over the desk, his bandages smoldering. Well, I can't say that. Your son was made to suffer greatly, after all. That only made the man's flames burn hotter as his bandages caught. You're damned right. He ripped them away and tossed them into the garbage basket, leaving his face bare save for the Glasgow smile left by the surgeries. That decayed gate I found was obviously because of the villain Tetsu and Kirishima helped apprehend. But that doctor, the one with the mechanical arms, his eyes seemed to burn with latent anger. He tortured my son. He made a fist and slammed it down on the desk hard enough to leave a crater in the wood. Do you have any idea what it's like to know that someone who harmed your family was allowed to escape? Nezu, of course, shook his head. Regrettably, while I was in the government's possession, I was rendered incapable of reproducing, so having a family is not in my future, the mammal said, which only made the man growl. I do not make light of your predicament, Mr. Midoriya. Truly, I'm as upset about this as you are. I view my students as though they were my own. He spun around and gazed out the window into the courtyard, and to know that someone was able to lead an attack against my school, my haven for these incredible children, has angered me to the point that I am ready to retaliate with the full might of UA Academy. Hisashi straightened and crossed his arms. And what sort of retaliation are we talking about here, Nezu? The former mercenary asked. I'm all for hunting that bastard down, but we don't even have any leads. Nezu gave a slight shake of his head. We have no leads, yet, my friend, he said, and turned back around to face the angered father. Hopefully, with the raid on the Yakuza group happening today, we may yet find some answers. He sighed. I was told that the doctor was the one that experimented on your son, which explains how he was able to create those things, he said, making the man flinch. And, as I was discussing with All Might and Vlad King yesterday, he expressed a great interest in Eri, which led us to believe that he had connections to these Yakuza. And what about the doctor himself? Hisashi asked. Any information on him? He was not pleased to see the mammal shake his head. None, only that he had a grandson that went missing a few years ago. Other than that, the man is an enigma. He sighed, and leaned forward, but I fear that I must ask you a dire favor, Mr. Midoriya. The man looked at him, interested. The children. This first week has shown them how dark the world can be, yet we have failed as teachers to hone their skills enough to properly prepare them for it. He looked at the man with a gleam in his eye. Yet, I understand one of our students underwent a quirk evolution. Right, Hisashi nodded. Miss Hagakure. He remembered the girls discussing her quirk while on the bus to the USJ the day of the attack. Apparently she has some psychic abilities now. Indeed, Nezu nodded, and several other students from both first-year classes have quirks that could be forcibly made to undergo the same evolution as she was, which would mean. Hisashi held up a hand to stop him. None of your teachers have the knowledge to force a quirk evolution, Nezu, he said, a dark look coming to his face. Not even you. My teachers don't know the methods. No, he said, gesturing to the man with his paw, but one of my security staff does. Hisashi arched his brow. You don't know what you're asking of me, Nezu. On the contrary, my friend, Nezu shook his head. I think you'll find that I know exactly what I'm asking of you. He hopped off of his chair and stepped around his desk, paused behind his back and looked at the man dead in the eyes. A change is coming, Mr. Midoriya, whether we wish for it or not. He went on as the man looked at him in confusion. All Might, as on borrowed time. Now the man looked at the rodent with interest. I realize that I'm taking a very large risk by revealing this to you, and violating a friend's trust, but I feel that you must understand the gravity of the situation, he explained. The man gestured for him to continue. You have my attention. All Might has a very debilitating injury, the principal went on, and the injury takes a great toll on him every time he uses his power. Hisashi nodded, beginning to understand. That attack 2 days ago wasn't just to kidnap Eri, he surmised. I don't believe so. Though she did have a large part to play in the attempt, it seems that All Might was the true target. Nezu said, and as he grows weaker and weaker, the villains will surely take notice, and will most likely try again with more success. He hung his head low. I know that I am asking you to do something horrible, but I feel that these children will need the training you could offer. He looked up at him, and if what is to come confirms my fears, then an all-out war may be on the horizon. And you need soldiers, Hisashi muttered under his breath, reaching up to pinch his brow. Izuku I could most definitely train to fight more like myself, but the others, he looked back down at the mammal, they're too soft, Nezu, it won't work. Nezu gave him a pleading look. I am only asking you to try, he said softly. Yes, I realize that these children didn't come to this school to become soldiers, but soldiers are what they must become if they are to survive, surely you must see that. Hisashi frowned, turning his head to look out the window, his eyes falling on the children below. I've done things that no parent would want their children to know of, let alone allowing them to learn how to do them. He said, stepping around the principal to stand by the glass, I know that heroes have to sometimes kill to save the day, but me. He turned his head back to the rodent and smirked, I'm soaked head to toe in blood, Nezu, so I'll ask again, what do you want from me? Nezu nodded his head slowly, I'm not asking any more, Hisashi, I'm begging. He bowed his head, please, teach these children how to survive what's to come. Hisashi regarded him for a moment longer, then turned back to the window, my class will follow my rules. He said, if there's anyone that I think can't cut it, then they're back in the regular class. Understood. I understand, Nezu said, sounding hopeful. Every day, from morning to the last bell, they're mine whenever I call for them. He turned around to face the mammal, no one interferes. I can manage that, Nezu agreed, some may even volunteer to help you. Hisashi let out a short bark of laughter, we'll see about that, he said, there's some students I'd like to speak with right away, matter of fact, I should address Class 1A in person. He stepped toward the door, if at any time you want me to stop, then tell me immediately. He spared one last look over his shoulder, but keep in mind that these children won't stay innocent for much longer, bar my special training. Nezu sighed deeply, I'm afraid that they stop being children the moment they walk through my gates, Mr. Midoriya. Class 1A dorms. Several hours later that day, the entirety of Class 1A was gathered in the common room of their dormitory. Kyoka was confused about the suddenness of the gathering, but Izuku had sent out a mass text to the rest of the class for them to meet him there. Any idea what this is about, Jiro? Kaminari asked, leaning too close for her comfort. I mean, why would Midoriya call us all down here like this? She shrugged before scooting away from him. No idea, Thunderbolt, she said, her insult making the boy falter, but whatever it is, I don't think we're going to like it. Goes without saying, Bakugo sneered, that damn nerd's got a lot of balls to call me down like this. Kyoka just rolled her eyes at the boy. Why Eri calls him Uncle Baku is beyond me. She thought while twirling one of her jacks nervously before Mina and Toru took up the seats on either side of her, saving her from Kaminari. So, I noticed that you and Midori were really cozy with each other today, the pink-skinned romantic said in a giddy tone, anything you want to dish on. Toru giggled as their friend blushed while her jacks started tying themselves in knots. Oh, come on, Mina, you know she can't handle this kind of teasing. She said, making her glad that the invisible girl was coming to her defense. Besides, it's not like he dropped the L-bomb on her. She heard Kyoka squeak, and saw her cheeks turn so red that she could feel the heat coming from her face. Oh, Toru's mouth opened in a wide O shape. Oh my gosh, he didn't. He did. Mina squealed happily. Look at her face. Kyoka quickly covered her face with her hands while the two girls began pestering her for details. Thankfully, Momo came to her rescue. Now, girls, there's no need to badger her like this, she half berated the pair. Besides, this is a private matter, no matter how romantic it is. She squealed and swooned a moment later, Mina and Toru following suit. Ugh, really, Momo? You, too? Kyoka groaned as her best friend just smiled at her, her cheeks a happy pink. It wasn't even that big of a deal. Mina leaned heavily on her left shoulder. Girl, this is our first year of high school. Toru leaned on her right shoulder, and you already have one of the cutest guys in our class confessing his love to you. Kyoka squirmed in her seat, and I said that it's not that big of a deal. She whined as the two girls pressed on her, come on. It's not like we got hot and heavy. That is highly inappropriate for someone of your age, Miss Jiro. Iida shouted from across the room, Ashido and Hagakure, cease this insensitive talk at once, you're clearly making her uncomfortable. Oh, butt out, Iida. Mina huffed with her hands on her hips, you probably wouldn't know what to do with a girl even if she gave you an instruction manual. I beg your pardon. Iida sounded utterly outraged, I happen to know a great deal about human anatomy, thank you very much. Toru got in on the insults while Kyoka took the time to slink out from between them, only to be grabbed from behind by Mina. Whoa, no you don't. Mina giggled, we are getting the deets, and that's that. Her hands ghosted across her ribs, startling a shriek of laughter out of Kyoka. Mina gained an absolutely evil gleam in her eyes, ooh, I think I found her weakness. Get her, Toru. Kyoka squealed as Toru joined in on the tickle attack, ah. No no no, stoop. Kyoka shrieked while jabbing at them with her jacks. Momo giggled at their antics while she noticed that Kaminari had gained a very dejected look on his face. Kaminari, is something wrong? She asked. The blonde shook his head, oh, nah, nothing's wrong with me. He said, though she didn't miss the wistful look he threw in Kyoka's direction. The girl cupped her cheek in thought, ah, so that's it, is it? She sighed, well, while I'm sure it won't cause any trouble, I should probably bring it up with Kyoka later so that she knows, at the very least. Before the vice president of the class could spare any more thoughts on the subject, the front doors opened up and in walked Izuku and his father, the latter dressed in full costume save for the open face of his helmet mask. Mr. Midoriya, you're okay, Tsuyu said, I'm glad to see you back on your feet after those burns we saw. Hiroshima gave the man a thumbs up, pretty manly scars, too, sir. Hisashi nodded to the two students, thank you both, he said, gesturing for Izuku to join them as his son went to rescue his girlfriend from her tormentors. But I'm sure you're all wondering why Izuku sent you all a text asking you to gather here. The students nodded, well, that was my doing. He revealed while the students all looked at each other in confusion, Kyoka looking toward Izuku while the boy shrugged and shook his head. I'm sure you're all still recovering from this week's attack, so I'll be brief about this, he said and cleared his throat. Starting next week, up until the sports festival, I will be pulling various students from class for special training. His words got the students to chattering. Quiet now, he said and continued, you are free to refuse these special classes, but I will say that Izuku will be participating as well. He looked in his son's direction, I'm sorry to say that your fighting style is in dire need of improvement, son. Izuku shook his head slowly, you don't have to tell me that, he said somewhat bitterly, I know I need more training. Which is why I've been asked to start this extra class, Hisashi went on, during these classes, you won't be learning to be heroes, he said with a shake of his head, you'll be learning how to fight. How to take down an opponent. To kill if necessary. He let that sink in, many of the students looking very frightened, but most important of all, we will improve upon your quirks. Sir, Momo said, what about our normal studies? She asked, won't these new classes get in the way? Hisashi gave a nod of his head, I would assume so, but Nezu was the one that suggested this idea, he told the girl, so I would also assume, hopefully without making an ass of myself, that he is going to be lenient with your grades. He said, his small joke getting a few chuckles, and a snort from Bakugo. Toru raised her hand, hey, teach, when you said we'd work on our quirks, does that mean? Hisashi nodded his head again, it means we'll be working on your new abilities, Miss Hagakure, he said with a small smirk at her, but at least you're able to keep yourself visible no awe. Quote, she held up her other hand showing him Izuku's power cuff, never mind then. He sighed, but all of you here have your limits, and I'm sure that you know where they are. He continued as he gained some nods from the students, and if you don't know those limits, I intend to help you find them. He took a breath, and then I'm going to teach you to ignore them. Ignore our limits? Iida asked. Exactly. Hisashi pressed on. Most heroes can exceed their limits, but there are a select few that can flat out ignore them for an almost overwhelming rush of power. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on a number of students he was ready to take under his wing. And those that have hit their proverbial walls. He looked directly at Shoto Todoroki, who gave the man a frosty glare. I'm going to help you break them. His eyes narrowed, and Shoto wisely chose to look away. These lessons will include, but will not be limited to, quirkless combat training, quirk training, and quirk combat training. He continued, if anyone here thinks that they won't be able to handle it, then I repeat that you're free to refuse the training, and focus on your normal classes. He looked toward his son, except for you two. He said to Izuku and Kyoka, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to push you two the most out of everyone here, and I think you know why. He said while the two of them nodded, with Kyoka reaching down to grasp Izuku's hand. When can we seriously start? Bakugo asked with a glare at the man. I don't need a stinking week off to recover from some weak-ass villains trying to make a name for themselves. He got up from his seat and let off a few small explosions from his palms. I'm ready to go right now. Hisashi smirked at the boy. Well, then, you'll be happy to know that you can all come to Gym Gamma first thing in the morning, 7 sharp. He said with a groan emanating from the rest of the group, and then we'll see just how much you can handle, Bakugo. The lower levels of the Jaku hospital were full of activity as the special guest arrived. Nurses were moving with the utmost speed and care as they moved the equipment and medical supplies to their needed stations. A containment unit was also moved into the room in case the worst-case scenario occurred. Have all available treatment options made ready, that includes treatments for the Devil's Breath. Kyudai barked at his staff, we want this young man back on his feet as quickly as possible. He called one nurse over, Miss Sori, I need you up above. Make sure nothing is amiss with the normal patients please, and keep watch for any interesting prospects. Yes, Doctor. Miyabi, I want you down in my lab, he called to another, set aside my special tools. If this case is as serious as I've been led to believe, then we may need to operate. Yes, Doctor. Kyudai surveyed the work, pleased with the progress when one of his orderlies came into the room. Sir, they've arrived. Ah, right on schedule. The man said, have our patient brought into examination room No X23, and assign Ms. Haruno to them for vitals and blood work until I arrive. He said, also, have some refreshment brought in for Wolfram and his companions, he called out as an afterthought. I'll be along shortly. Yes, Doctor. Kyudai felt his excitement rising as he waddled out of the room, intent on taking more than a few samples from the patient before treating him. Not to mention how he could exploit the man's underlings. He took his time in gathering his tools, and the necessary implements to take several blood samples before heading to the elevator. The lower levels of his hospital were meant for the treatment of the master's underlings when they were in need, but he kept them open to some side business in order to gain access to unique quirks, or find candidates for his experiments. Room No X23 was such a room. A day or so back he had seen one of his clients there, but thankfully it hadn't needed much cleaning. As he exited the elevator, and made his way down the hall, he heard raised voices. Oh, what now? He said as he shuffled along at a quicker pace. Then he saw the nurse he had assigned to the room scurry out of the door. Haruno, he shouted to gain her attention, what's all this noise? She looked at the man with relief. Oh, good, you're here. She yelped, he's having an episode. That got the man running as he blew past her and into the room. Wolfram was there, holding onto one side of the man he had brought in, while a man wrapped in red bandages held onto the other. A woman knelt down in front of him rubbing his chest, while a large, wolfman stood at his back. He looked at the doctor. Oh, great, you finally made it. He shouted in a gruff tone, this is a bad one, Doc. Kyudai nodded. All business now, Wolfram, if you and one of the gentlemen could help the patient onto the examination table. He suggested. Right, Doc. He looked at the bandaged man. Mummy, give us a hand. The now named Mummy got under the man's left arm while Wolfram took the right. The woman helped them both with his feet. Miss Haruno, did you manage to take some samples before this happened? The nurse shook her head. I'm sorry, sir, but this happened quite suddenly. so I wasn't able to draw any blood, or take any other samples. No matter. He handed his supplies to the nurse. Let's make sure our guest is comfortable for the moment. Start with a saline drip, antibiotics and pain relief medication, and then we can do the usual routine. He said before turning to the woman. While she's doing that, my dear, would you mind telling me a little about my patient before we get started? The woman, a rather tall, ravishing woman with long red hair and glasses, nodded. His name is Kamui Sumeragi. He's around 29 years old, and has a familiar history of cellular degeneration. Kyudai beeped on his teeth. That is a difficult disease to treat. He reached up and started playing with his mustache, a nervous tic that he had recently picked up. The wolfman looked at him. You will be able to treat him, won't you? He asked, sounding worried. Of course, the doctor nodded, given that this particular illness is what is afflicting him, but it is going to be a lengthy treatment, I'm afraid. He explained, thinking on how he could make the treatments more manageable. Can you tell me of his symptoms? It's only when he overuses his quirk, the woman said, other times he's fine. The doctor hummed in thought. That would be an advanced form of cellular degeneration, aptly named quirk degeneration, he sighed, turning to the nurse who had just drawn a vial of blood. Ms. Haruno, take that sample down to the labs and look for any signs of QD, and have someone update me on the status of our Mr. Sumeragi's room. I want this man to have our best silver service. Right away, doctor, the nurse said before hurrying out of the room. The man, Kamui, turned his head toward the doctor. What's to be done about my condition? Kyudai could only shrug. Only time will tell, my boy, he said, but I will say that when you leave this place, you will be a new man, one way or another. His grin started to widen. I wonder, my young friend, he said, what would you say to a little experimental medicine? Thursday. Day number 1 of training. As promised, Hisashi Midoriya pulled no punches in his training regime. Thursday morning the students of Class 1A were all assembled in Gym Gamma, some looking more sleepy than most. In the center of the gym was a large concrete boxing ring, complete with corner posts and rope barriers. And in the ring itself was none other than the Prowler himself. It's good that you could all make it here today, he said with an even tone. Today will mark your first day of training under me. He told the students, for the remainder of this week, only those from Class 1A will be present. However, starting Monday, I will be calling over students from Class 1B to undergo the same training. No one spoke as the man jumped out of the ring, over the barrier and landed in a crouch before them. But that does not mean that you should feel privileged. His tone now became darker. While I will commend all of you on how well you handled yourselves during the USJ incident, many of you were sorely lacking in combat skills. He began walking down the line of students. Midoriya, he stopped in front of his son who grimaced. You allowed your emotions to take over, and nearly cost yourself and a fellow student your lives. Izuku looked away from him. It won't happen again. The Prowler just snorted. You keep telling yourself that. He chuckled and moved on, his eyes falling on Katsuki. Bakugo, I heard from Recovery Girl that the special move you used against that mutant did some damage your arms. He snapped when the ashen blonde tried to retort. Your quirk is deadly even with small amounts of your nitro sweat, yet you almost pushed yourself to the point of being useless to bring down a single opponent that was already on its last leg. You're one to talk, Bakugo muttered. You were hospitalized because you overused your quirk. The eyes of his mask glowed, and yet I was still able to fight, whereas you were nearly incapable of defending yourself. He pointed out, which is why you're here. He continued down the line, why all of you are here. He stopped in front of Jiro. Miss Jiro here is the only one that I can say did exceptionally well during the battle, as she not only made use of her quirk in battle, but also used hand-to-hand techniques. Kyoka rubbed her right arm. I still took a pretty bad hit, though, she said while remembering how numb her arm had been after the battle. You were also going up against a vastly superior opponent, Prowler said. While I wouldn't pit you against that type of creature again anytime soon, it's still a decent accomplishment for someone not even finished with their first year of hero school. He then stepped back to the ring. Now, on with today's training. He pointed to two students. Iida, Midoriya, step up. Both students did so without question. The Prowler then produced a familiar-looking device, I believe you're both familiar with these, he said as he brandished a pair of Izuku's power-dampening cuffs. You'll be wearing these for the remainder of the day, he said as the two boys held up their wrists. No, slap them on yourselves, that way you can deactivate them on your own, he told them before handing them the capture tools. Izuku and Iida shared a look before they activated the bands and placed them on their wrists, both of their quirks immediately falling dormant. The Prowler gave a nod. Good, he said approvingly. Now step into the ring, he said, moving aside so the boys could enter. Now, I will explain the rules, he said as he picked up a boxing bell from the ground. Once I ring this bell, the two of you are to go at each other full force in combat. Sir, Iida said before the man could continue, wouldn't it be better to teach us a few fighting styles first? The Prowler sighed in exasperation. I'm getting to that, Iida, he groaned. Speedsters, always so impatient. The rest of his classmates laughed while Iida sputtered. Now, as I was saying, once the fighting starts, go at your opponent at full force with intention to immobilize. After the fight, I will give you pointers on your chosen style of fighting. Iida, I assume that you favor a style of kickboxing. Iida nodded. Yes, sir, but I do tend to mix in other styles that favor kicks. The speedster said, giving Izuku an unwitting clue into his fighting style while the Prowler shook his head. Anyway, Prowler said, to your corners, boys, he said as the two took up their corners in the ring. Mina then giggled. Hey, Cheech, since this is a match, how about we have Jiro be the round girl? Ah. Mina's giggle turned into a pained yelp as not only Kyoka's jacks, but Tsuyu's tongue found their marks. Hey, I was just kidding, she whined after the assault. Without further interruption, the Prowler rang the bell. 5 minutes later, Uncle, Iida howled while tapping his arm wildly on the ring floor as Izuku stood over him with his arms weaved through the teen's legs in a brutal cloverleaf leg lock. Appropriately, Prowler rang the bell to signal Izuku's win. Would anyone care to comment on the match? The former mercenary asked as Izuku released his opponent and helped him to his stinging feet. Yeah, surprisingly, it was Kaminari that spoke up. Iida was relying way too much on his kicks to try to knock Midoriya out, the blonde commented, and since he's got a way smaller body, it was really easy for him to dodge his attacks and knock him off of his feet. The Prowler nodded approvingly. Good, you were paying attention, the man said as he turned to the two combatants. Midoriya, your moves were a tad sloppy, but nonetheless quick and efficient, he commented to the boy before he turned to Iida. Iida, your kicks were indeed powerful, even without the use of your quirk. However, the movements in which you performed those kicks were too wide and flamboyant, he said while the teen nodded in understanding. These two flaws were enough to slow your movement down even more, he said before addressing the class. To fight better in the future, all of you will need to learn to keep your movements tight, precise, and quick in order to prevail against an opponent. He went on with a gesture to the two boys. Large and powerful blows can indeed be an adequate way to put your foe on their back, however, you should always prioritize being quick and fluid in your movements. Midoriya's movements, while they were clumsy, were quick and precise, which allowed him to best an opponent that had the clear advantage in size. Izuku hung his head. I'm not that short, am I? He looked up at Iida for a moment before the taller boy patted his shoulder in a consoling manner, making his head drop back down to his chest in despair. Ahem, Prowler said, a clear advantage in size and power, the man said while the class snickered. Izuku peeked up a little bit toward his loving girlfriend, only to see her just barely holding back her own laughter. No. Not you, too, Kyoka, he wailed mentally, even the girl I love thinks I'm short. After Prowler was finished giving his lecture, the next 4 hours saw each student pairing up with another to conduct quirkless combat, the one receiving the worst of it being Hitoshi Shinso, whose body was still not up to the hero course standards. It did not help that he was stuck with Sato, either, the large teen a veritable tank even without his sugar rush quirk. And after the time had passed the 4th hour, the Prowler called them all to order. The students fell in line like they had just been through a meat grinder, each of them sweating enough to drench their clothes. You've all done well for your first day, so far, he said from his seat on an ice chest. He got up and opened it, revealing it to be full of chilled water bottles. Now, take a bottle each and drink it slowly, he said. jumping out of the way as the stampede of students flooded forward in desperation. "You'll rest for half an hour, and then we'll move on to quirk training." He laughed as the students groaned. Kyoko was flaring out the collar of her shirt in order to cool herself off while sitting next to her boyfriend. "Geez, he's never been this hard on us whenever we sparred with him," she complained as Izuku gulped down a mouthful of water. "I guess that attack really got to him, didn't it?" she asked as the boy just shrugged. "Probably," he breathed heavily while running a hand through his sweaty hair. "But at least he's helping us where we really need it." The girl leaned on his shoulder tiredly. "Not so sure if the quirk training's gonna help me that much," she confided. "I can use my enhanced hearing for a lot, and there's the sonic attacks, but other than that, I'm not sure if I can keep up." She sighed and closed her eyes, intent on resting longer. "Bakugo, were you taking it easy on me?" Ochako demanded tiredly as she sat next to her combat partner. For some odd reason, the blows she had been expecting, and the blows she had received seemed a little off, not as powerful as she had been expecting them to be. Katsuki gave the girl the barest hint of a glance. "Like hell," he muttered just as tired as she was. "You beeping nailed me, remember?" He pointed to his left eye where a brilliant shiner was beginning to form. "What the hell made you think that?" Ochako shrugged. "I just thought you might not be taking the fight seriously," she sighed. "I mean, I'm not that strong, so." Much to his irritation, the pouting face she started to make caused a small flutter in his stomach. "I mean, when you fought Midoriya, you were like a totally different person." "Yeah, a real ass," Kaminari laughed, which made the ashen blonde's eyes sharpen dangerously, "but he wasn't throwing explosions left and right, so sure his attacks didn't do the damage you were expecting." Katsuki just growled at him while Ochako laughed. "You better be glad I've got this beeping bracelet on, ya Pikachu knock off." Katsuki growled. "Just wait till the sports festival, I'll blow your ass to Kingdom Come." "Still, though," Ochako giggled, "hitting you was like hitting a brick wall." She shook her hands out with a wince. "What did you do to make yourself so hard?" Behind them, Toru and Mina started sputtering before falling over each other in laughter. Katsuki turned around and snarled, "Go on. Say something. I dare ya," he roared at the giggling pair. Mina sat up to wipe a mirthful tear from her eye. "We won't, but God." She descended into giggles again. That was so hard to pass up. Toru, on the other hand, couldn't resist. That's what she said. Both of them started cracking up, followed by the rest of the class. Not just because of the joke, but also because Ochako realized what she'd just said. The only reason she wasn't floating was due to the fact that she was still wearing her power-dampening cuff. Katsuki was uncharacteristically red as the laughter began to die out. "It's because I used my quirk a lot," the boy grumbled as the rest of the class finally calmed down, setting off even cherry bomb-sized explosions used to hurt like a beeping bitch. He looked down at his hands. "I broke them a lot when I started training my quirk, even broke my whole beeping arm once." "I remember that." Izuku smiled back at him. Auntie Mitsuki laughed for hours. To everyone's surprise, the ashen blonde actually cracked a small grin of his own. "That beeping hag," he snorted. "Anyway, every time I broke a bone, it healed back twice as strong a normal broken bone, and now I barely feel the backlash of my large-scale blasts unless I fire them back to back." Ochako thought back to their battle trials on the second day of school. "Is that why you have those huge bracers?" she asked. "I remember that blast you fired off at Midoriya was pretty huge compared to the others you'd been using." Katsuki nodded. "That's exactly why I have them." He nodded. "Too bad I probably won't be able to use them during the festival." Ochako giggled. "I think the rest of us would be lucky if you didn't." Aoyama had one of those sparkling smiles on his face as he regarded the two from a few rows back. "Mon Dieu, the two of them seem to be getting along quite well, n'est-ce pas?" he commented to Iida while the boy nodded. "Indeed, it's rare for Bakugo to be civil with anyone outside of Kirishima, and that's just barely passable," he said in an overly hushed tone, his glasses glinting in the light. "Most peculiar." Unbeknownst to the pair, Katsuki had overheard them and was now sporting an even more prominent blush as well as an angry vein pulsing on his forehead. "I can beeping hear you, you bastards," he growled mentally, "and I'm always beeping civil." Just then, Prowler came back to the group. Change of plans, kids, he called out. Lunch rush just chewed my ear off for not scheduling in a lunch break. The group of students laughed at him. Yeah, laugh it up. Now get your pansy asses to lunch, pronto. He roared out. Last one back has to run 10 laps around the campus. What? Oh hell no, were the prominent answers as the entirety of Class 1A jumped, scrambled and crawled over each other to get out of the training area. Friday. Day number 2 of training. The second day of training saw the class jumping right into quirk training. Izuku and Kaminari were paired up in order to maximize the amount of power Izuku could store up inside his body, and the amount of electricity Denki could produce before blowing his fuse. Come on, Kaminari, Prowler called out to the electrically shrouded teen, is that all you've got? No, Denki stammered out, his head already smoking from his approaching limit. Prowler cocked his head, what's that? I can't hear you. No sir. Denki snapped back, upping the voltage another few thousand volts while Izuku tried absorbing it all. The Prowler looked at his son, what about you, Midoriya? What's your damage? Izuku had his hands on Kaminari's shoulders while facing the other boy, his teeth clenched tightly to keep himself from crying out, I can't still handle more. Izuku ground out. Good. The ex-mercenary nodded, and moved on. Bakugo. Why am I not hearing any explosions? He called out to the exhausted teen as he was leaning on his knees, are you quitting on me, boy? No. Bakugo snapped before throwing his hands up in the air and letting loose a massive burst from both of his hands. No what? Prowler prodded loudly. No sir. Bakugo howled right before setting off another blast bigger than the last one. The Prowler nodded, pleased, good, very good. He moved on to the next student. How are we doing, Shinso? He asked of the mind-controlling teen as he stood in front of 3 third-year students. The author will give the reader 3 guesses to the identity of said third years. Any progress? Shinso's task was to mentally command the students to perform tasks instead of issuing orders verbally. Slow, sir, the boy slurred, sweating profusely. I managed to make all of them move a step. He gasped out before collapsing to his knees. The 3 third years were suddenly freed from his control. Damn it. His fist impacted the floor with a loud crack. Prowler raised his brow at the boy before hollering, break time. He then strode over to Shinso and knelt in front of him. Frustration with yourself is fine, Shinso, he said while taking the boy's hand in his own to examine the damage, but self-inflicted harm is strictly forbidden from this point on. He cautioned the boy, Midoriya, Asui. Escort Shinso to the nurse's office, he has a broken hand. Asui, who had been clinging to the ceiling using her quirk, dropped down from above while Izuku staggered over, his chest glowing brightly. Shinso wanted to argue, but his 2 friends were already frog-marching him out of the gym. Seriously, guys, I'm fine on my own, Shinso whined as he supported his injured hand, you don't really have to come with me. The 3 of them had been going back and forth on the subject since leaving the gym. You're gonna miss training. I can catch up. Hiro, Tsuyu croaked, besides, Mr. Midoriya wanted us to go with you. She put in with a hint of finality in her voice, or as much as her froggy voice could manage, if we left you on your own, then he'd probably make us run the campus perimeter. Shinso looked at the arachnid on his other side, he wouldn't, would he? He asked, fearing the answer. Izuku sighed deeply, he probably would. This in turn made the other 2 pale while the boy bit his lip before speaking again, listen, you guys. I wanna apologize. Tsuyu looked at him curiously, apologize for what? Yeah, Shinso said, confused as to why he would feel the need, you haven't done anything. Izuku just shook his head, no, I did do something, he frowned as he cast his eyes down at his feet. I abandoned you guys in the shipwreck zone during the attack, he said guiltily. Shinso looked at him with surprise, and then promptly smacked him on the back of the head with his good hand. Yoch, Shinso hissed, waving his now injured right hand, what the hell's your head made of? He groaned pitifully. You should have let me smack him with my tongue, Tsuyu croaked angrily while fuming at the green-haired boy. Midoriya, how are we supposed to be mad at you for what you did back then, Hiro? She demanded as heatedly as she could. You only left us behind because you saw that Eri was close by, Hiro, she croaked, remembering how scared the little girl had been when she had found her and the others waiting in the mountain area. I'd have done the same thing if my little brother or sister were in danger. Shinso nodded. She's right, he said, and Eri's not just any kid, she's your daughter. He reminded him with a small grunt, if you hadn't rushed in to save her, then you'd be a piss-poor father, and even worse hero. Izuku still felt guilty about it, however, but you guys could have been. Shinso cut him off with a wave of his hand. Midoriya, I swear, if you keep letting this bother you, then I'm gonna brainwash you into dancing a samba in front of the whole of classes 1A and B in your boxers. He threatened. And he meant it, too. Besides, look what happened to you in the end, he reminded him, making the boy flinch. If you feel guilty about leaving us behind, then you can say that you already paid the price. He jabbed the boy in the chest with his still aching right hand. Don't think I haven't seen that new scar on your chest. Suyu croaked. I didn't know you got another scar from all that happened, she said sadly. If you really want to play the guilt game, Midoriya, then I feel just as bad about not being able to do anything while you were being beaten half to death by that villain with the mechanical arms. Shinso was in total agreement with her on that point, and I wasn't fast enough to get you away from him, he said with a hint of sorrow in his voice. None of that shit happened to me, and I still have nightmares about it. Izuku frowned. If he was to tell the truth, he had dreamed about being tortured every night since the attack happened. More often than not, it was just him being tortured, but after he managed to go back to sleep his nightmares had warped in, making him watch as Kyoka and Eri had gone through the same thing. They were quiet as they continued down the hall, but Izuku stopped when they walked by Hound Dog's office. You guys go on ahead, he mumbled, making a small gesture to the guidance counselor's office. Mr. Hound Dog and Kyoka have been wanting me to see him, he explained as the two of them nodded and moved off while Izuku knocked on the door. There was a soft call from inside, and Izuku opened the door. Ah, Mr. Midoriya, Hound Dog said in his friendly manner, I was hoping you'd stop by soon. Izuku nodded as he came into the room. Yeah, he smiled tentatively as Hound Dog gestured for him to have a seat. Sorry I've been putting this off. No need to apologize. The counselor shook his head. Now then, where would you like to start? Izuku sighed. I guess I should start out. His lip began to tremble, with how absolutely terrified I was, when the mist villain separated us. Hound Dog nodded and opened a pad in front of him. That's a very good place to start. Meanwhile, do you think he'll be okay? Suyu asked as she glanced back over her shoulder toward where their friend had disappeared. Next to her, Shinso gave a grunt. I think so, he said. Physically, he's way stronger than most of our class, but mentally, I think he needs this. Suyu gave a worried croak. We should probably tell Mr. Midoriya where he is when we get back, she said. I wouldn't want him getting into trouble with his own father. The brainwashing teen snickered. Honestly, I think Prowler might have planned it this way, he said, gaining the girl's attention. You said it yourself. He's his dad, and I'm willing to bet that he was just as worried about him as the rest of us were. Hero. Then how do you explain him sending the three of us to Recovery Girl at the same time? She asked with a finger tapping at her lips. Do you think that he figured out that he was feeling guilty about leaving us on the boat to go after Eri? Shinso nodded. If he didn't, then I bet that Kyoka did, he reasoned, giving the girl a small look. Remember, those two have spent months together before school started, and they weren't even a couple then. Shinso shrugged. It's kind of a bummer that Midoriya doesn't stay in the dorms with the rest of us, but it's understandable since he has Eri to look after. Kyoka only stays there since she wanted to get out of her parents' house. That's true, Hiro, the girl croaked cutely, almost like she was laughing. Even when she's with me and the other girls, Midoriya and Eri are always the main topic. Shinso chuckled before reaching up to rub the back of his neck. Speaking of topics, are you, like, free tomorrow? He stammered out, a blush rising to his cheeks. Suyu looked at him blankly, then gained a cute blush of her own. I like movies, Hiro, she said, sounding happy. I'll buy the popcorn. Saturday. Day number 3 of training. On the third day of the class training session, the Prowler asked for 3 students to stay behind for extra lessons. Those students were Ochako Uraraka, Denki Kaminari, and Toru Hagakure. They were noticeably nervous as the man stood before them, his arms tucked behind his back. Their nerves were put at ease when the man disengaged his mask, and stopped being the prowler, going back to being the friendly and often kind Hisashi Midoriya. "You've all been working hard these past 3 days, he said to the three of them. "I'm not easily impressed because I've seen a fair amount of heroes and villains with quirks that are truly the stuff of fiction." He smiled at them, "But I've also seen those same heroes and villains not try half as hard as you three have since we began." Toru frowned at him. Cheech, she mumbled, still sounding nervous, "You're kind of scaring me with how much praise you're loading on us." Hisashi nodded in understanding, "And I can see why when considering all that I've put you through," he chuckled, "but I wanted to speak with you three in particular today because there's a facet of your quirks that you haven't even thought of yet." Denki looked down at his hands, raising a few sparks to his fingertips. "Pretty sure I'm just a human battery, sir," he sighed in depression. All of his attempts to channel his electricity into a long-range form of attack had been in vain. All he had managed was generating enough backlash for his head to blow a fuse. He was surprised when the man strode forward and placed his hand on his shoulder. "You're wrong, Kaminari," he said before stepping back. "Each one of you has an aspect to your quirk that is fundamentally the same, but the execution of that aspect depends on you." He smiled at Ochako as the girl looked down at the pads on her fingers. "On your individual will. Your will to succeed." The brunette looked at him in determination. "What is it?" she demanded. "What do I have to do?" Hisashi smiled at her. "All of you," he gestured to the three teenagers, "have the aspect of flight." He almost laughed at the stunned looks on their faces. "Yes, even you, Miss Hagakure." He smirked at her. "Your quirk's new abilities allow you to form psychic barriers around objects, and that includes yourself. And you are capable of moving those barriers." Toru shook her head. "But I can barely form a bubble around a softball," she mumbled. "I couldn't." She trailed off as the man shook his head. "Doubt is your enemy, Hagakure," he told her. "If you doubt yourself, then you will never advance." He smiled at her. "You displayed incredible potential during the attack on the school when you fought to protect Eri, and that drive to protect her allowed you to access these new powers." He moved to stand in front of her. "Close your eyes, Hagakure." Biting her lip, she did so with only a moment of hesitation. "Now," his voice sounded soothing, "take a deep breath." She did so, finding that it quelled her nerves. "Now remember," he said, "remember that feeling of wanting to protect something so desperately that you'd willingly put yourself in danger to do it." An image of Eri came to her mind. The little girl was smiling happily at her in her mind. It made a strong pull at the front of her mind above her eyes, where Recovery Girl told her that her quirk came from. "Use your power. Make it bend to your will," he said, "make it raise you up." She felt the now familiar draw on her quirk as a thin layer of her quirk spread itself over her. "Wow," she heard Ochako breathe out, "that's so pretty." Her lips perked up at that and she wondered fleetingly what the girl was talking about. "But how do I make it raise me?" she wondered, thinking back to when she had taken the vial of her blood back from the mad scientist. "I just wanted it," she breathed in and breathed out once more, willing the layers of her quirk to flow down her body and pool around her feet. She could see it in her mind. A disc made of prismatic glass anchored to her feet. "I want to fly." A breeze seemed to swirl around her as the girl's hair tickled her face. She heard the others gasp from below her. Then she heard someone applauding. "Well done, Miss Hagakure." When she opened her eyes it was to see herself well over 20 feet from the ground with her teacher and two friends beaming up at her as Hisashi smiled up at her. "Well done." Sunday. Half day 4 of training. The class was watching with anticipation as their two classmates circled each other in the ring. The two fighters were none other than Izuku Midoriya and Tenya Iida once again, though this time it seemed that the speedster was keeping his movements tighter to his body. His kicks were faster and more on point as Izuku struggled to keep up with him. Though that didn't mean that Izuku was losing the battle. Izuku favored strong and quick punches to kicks, but getting too close to the wiry teen was a near-fatal mistake when sparring with him. As Iida had found out a few days prior, Izuku was a grappler. And getting caught by him was a painful experience. Even Bakugo had to admit that the verdette had a powerful grip, even without his quirk. Iida moved in, attempting a knee to his face, but Izuku blocked him and spun around, sweeping his legs out from under him. Iida managed to catch himself before he hit the floor, but not fast enough to avoid Izuku twisting around and grasping his leg. Ow 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 ow, dang it, Iida yelled as Izuku got him in a knee bar, his knee quickly hyperextending to the point of an almost unbearable pain. I yield. The Prowler rang the bell, and that's an even split, the man said as Izuku released his classmate, 2 to Iida, and 2 to Midoriya. He said as the boys dusted themselves off and stepped out of the ring, you're both improving bit by bit, but Iida, you should probably work on flexibility, he commented as the boy sat down and started massaging his injured leg, you seem prone to hyperextension. Iida nodded, everyone in my family has this problem, he grumbled, even my brother has problems with it in his arms. The Prowler nodded in understanding, it's most likely because of those engines your brother has in his arms, and the ones you have in your legs, he reasoned, my advice right now would be to get an ice pack on that, and take some anti-inflammatory medication. Tonight, do some stretching exercises and then you'll most likely need to rest your leg tomorrow. Iida nodded in agreement, yes, sir. The Prowler then turned to his son, Midoriya, your fighting style has gotten much more refined since we began, he said with approval, keep up this pace, and you might be able to give me a challenge. He chuckled. Izuku just chuckled, nah, I'll settle for mom bouncing a rolling pin off your head. That was one time, the man stammered while the class burst out laughing. All of them had met with Inko Midoriya at one point or another since both she and Mika had begun helping Recovery Girl out in the nurse's office when one of them wasn't watching Eri while he and Kyoko were attending classes. And while the petite woman was as kind and friendly as her son, they had also seen her get angry with both her husband and her son when both had come into the office with Izuku sporting more than a few scrapes and bruises thanks to a sparring session with his father. The Prowler had been unable to show his face because of the large knot on his head from where the woman walloped him. The Prowler cleared his throat, all right, everyone, we'll end things here today, he said as the students breathed a collective sigh of relief, head over the lunch rush and get yourselves fed, then you can enjoy the rest of your day. He then added, and don't forget, we'll be hosting Class 1B tomorrow morning, so get a good night's sleep tonight, and have a light breakfast. We're going to run the gauntlet. Girls' locker room. A few minutes later. I can't believe you can fly, now. Mina gushed to the formerly invisible girl while Toru slapped her power cuff on, her body becoming more solid instead of see-through. And you're getting way better at staying visible without that thing. Toru giggled as she pulled her shirt over her head, I know, right? She beamed at her, thrilled that she was getting better at controlling her quirk. I can almost turn completely visible without it now, but I still need a lot of practice to keep it up without going invisible again. She grinned before wrinkling her nose, ew, I wish the locker rooms here had a shower, I totally reek. She complained while waving her hand in front of her face to get the smell of her own sweat away before she reached for her spare clothes she'd brought along. Momo peeked out from behind her locker, do you want some of my deodorant? She asked while offering her a bottle, it's lavender scented. The girl just shook her head, nah, I think I'll just take a nice long hot shower when we get back to the dorm. She sighed at just the thought of standing under the spray of hot water. I will say that the folks here spared no expense to make us comfortable. She giggled. Hey, Momo, I'll take that deodorant if you don't mind. Mina said while the girl simply tossed it to her, thanks. You're a total doll. Ochako smiled over at Toru while she was tying her sneakers. I'm seriously jealous of you right now, Hagakure, she giggled. I still can't get the hang of flying with the way my stomach acts because of my quirk. Both of them shared a laugh as they remembered the gravity user's attempts at flight. The results had not been as stellar as Toru's. After Toru had descended back to the ground, Ochako had tried her luck. But the poor girl hadn't had near the luck that Toru had had, resulting in a massive bout of nausea and the need for a mop. Oh, don't worry, Oh-chan, you'll get it, the bright-eyed girl grinned. Your quirk just works differently, so the same idea that Teach had for me wouldn't have worked. After cleaning up Ochako's attempt, The brunette had revealed that she had tried mentally spreading her quirk without using her pads. That had been a mistake. And thanks to that, she had been too sick for a second attempt. And both of them thanked Prowler for not pushing her into it. Besides, she mumbled, "Look what happened to Kaminari." Ochako bit her lip, "Yeah." Meanwhile, on the boy's side, "It was the worst thing I'd ever felt," Kaminari said as the others listened. "It was like my entire body was about to break apart." He trembled, hugging himself. "I know I wanted to control my power without hurting myself, but..." He trailed off, feeling ashamed that he was technically admitting that he was afraid of his quirk after the incident. Around the locker room, the other boys of Class 1A were silent. None of them had ever come close to what had happened to the electrification user. Izuku sat across from him, thinking over how to help him. "This is a problem," they heard Iida say. "Kaminari, are you sure that you weren't overloaded?" He asked as he stepped up to the team. "Remember when you tried to absorb some of Midoriya's energy yesterday?" The blonde nodded. "Yeah, but that was nothing like what I felt when I tried using my quirk to fly." Kaminari hung his head. "It felt..." He looked down at his hands where some scorch marks could still be seen on his skin. "It felt like the difference between night and day." He clenched his hands into fists. "When I absorbed some of Midoriya's energy, it felt different. Yeah, but it was still electricity of some kind." He looked up at Izuku. "But when I tried to fly, it felt like my electricity was trying to... I dunno. Burst out of me, like a bomb." Bakugo stepped forward. "Hey, Thunderhead," he grumbled, "you ever thought about how Deku used my explosions to power up?" He asked, making the blonde look at him, frowning. "None of us are real geniuses, but it doesn't take one to see that turning one of my blasts into electricity isn't what you'd call normal for someone with an electrical-based quirk." Midoriya nodded. "He's right," the verdette agreed, raising his fist to show them his bioelectrical veins that now ran through his body and into his hands as the green glow illuminated the limb to the point that they could make out blood veins and the bones in his arm. "I don't just generate electricity like you do, Kaminari. I absorb kinetic energy and convert it into electricity. Just like that hero over in America, Maverick." Shinso realized. "That guy uses his quirk to convert kinetic energy into raw power," he said with a grin. "I remember a TV special that had him and All Might facing off in a boxing match for some charity fund, and damned if the guy didn't turn the tables on the big guy." Kaminari groaned. "Guys, I get it, but this isn't really helping me. Here." He placed his head in his hands. "Even Midoriya's dad didn't know how to help me." Kirishima sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry, Kamibro." He reached for his locker. "I wish I could." "Yow!" he yelped, waving his hand. "Damned static." Just then Izuku's eyes flew open wide. "That's it." He jumped up, startling the others. "Kaminari, you're static." "I'm what now?" the blonde asked, a little freaked at the boy's sudden change in demeanor. Bakugo was quick to bonk the exuberant teen on the head. "Calm the hell down and explain," he shouted. "No one's gonna get your weird-ass analogies." Izuku pouted as he rubbed his head and half-glared half-pouted at the ashen blonde. "Kyoka gets them," he whined. "Do we look like your beeping girlfriend?" Bakugo growled. "Now get to the point, or I'm heading to lunch." Izuku rolled his eyes. Anyway, Kaminari, I think your quirk might have been misclassified," he started to explain as the boy looked at him, his brow raised. "I mean, when I look at other heroes that have electrical powers, they can easily be put into the huge pile of electrical manipulation quirks. But they had one thing that made them different from you." "Lemme guess." The lightning-haired teen frowned. "They didn't zap themselves." To his growing disappointment, Izuku nodded. "Just great." He hung his head. "Now what am I supposed to do?" Izuku wasn't finished yet, however. "Kaminari, listen," he said, gaining the teen's attention again. "That's just a part of it." He continued. "Your quirk isn't just that you have partial control over your electricity, it's that you generate it." The blonde was still so confused as to how this could help him. "Most of your electrical-themed heroes don't generate their own lightning like you do. They pull it from another source." He then pointed at himself. "Like I do." He then made a gesture toward the blonde. "But you generate it." Iida began to nod. "I think I can see what you're getting at, Midoriya," he muttered. "There was a heroine a few decades back that generated lightning like you do. but on a much grander scale, he said. Her quirk and heroine name was Surge. He began to smile, and her quirk allowed her not only to generate and manipulate lightning, but it also made her a sort of pseudo-speedster, but she was far faster than anyone is today that has a speed quirk. Kaminari was looking at the two of them. So this helps me, how? Bakugo groaned. Idiot, he palmed his face. Surge had to build up her electricity at the same time she manipulated it. He said, before miming holding a ball, think about it like this. Remember when Deku had you make an electro ball on the bus? He asked while the blonde nodded. That's both generation and manipulation. But you weren't about to throw it while we were all on that bus, you'd have fried us all. Kaminari frowned. I'm sorry, but I still kind of don't understand. Manipulation has a lot to do with what you intended to do with it, Zero put in from where he stood next to the door. With me, I just act like I'm flexing a muscle to shoot out my tape, get it? Izuku nodded. Right, he turned back to Kaminari. What did you do when you tried to fly? Kaminari thought for a moment. I tried to build up enough electricity to fly up like I had rocket boots on. To this, Bakugo groaned and smacked his head while Izuku's head dropped. I'm guessing that was the wrong way to do it. Ya think? Bakugo roared. It's no wonder you felt like you were gonna explode. Kaminari frowned. Kirishima sighed. Hate to say it, Kamibro, but even I know that much buildup of electricity is dangerous. If your body acts like a generator, then you probably came close to blowing yourself up like one of Bakugo's grenades. The faux redhead said while Kaminari looked horrified with himself. Sato stuck his head around one of the lockers. Hey guys, why don't we put a pin in this for now? He asked. I'm starving after this morning's training. Plus, Shinso sighed. I think Kaminari needs some time to process this. He gestured to the blonde while the boy in question was trembling with his near-fatal mistake. The boys all agreed as Iida offered to help the nervous blonde to the cafeteria while the rest of them trailed behind at a slower pace. Todoroki, Prowler called out as the students were leaving the gym, I wanna talk to you. Izuku looked over his shoulder at the heterochromic boy, you gonna be okay? He asked while the scarred teen nodded slowly. I haven't done anything wrong, so it's most likely nothing major, Shoto said before turning to speak with the man, leaving Izuku and the rest to leave. You wanted to see me, sir, Shoto said as he stood in front of the man. Prowler nodded before disengaging his helmet. I did, and I think you know why. He made a gesture to the boy's right side. I know that you have a dual-type quirk Todoroki. I said as much when I gave my lecture on Monday. He saw the boy lower his eyes away from him. What I want to know, young man, is why you haven't used the other aspect of your quirk. Shoto reached over and gripped his right arm. It's personal. The Prowler crossed his arms with his features hardening. Shoto Todoroki, I am, for the moment, your teacher, and I am doing my level best to see that you, along with the rest of Class 1A, are prepared for what's to come. He said, his voice cold and angry, but I can't do that if you aren't putting in a 100% effort into your training. The man said, I don't care about your personal feelings on your quirk, Todoroki. What I care about is sending you out into the world with a full arsenal in order to face the dangers of being a professional hero. He uncrossed his arms and jabbed the boy in the chest, and I can't do that, either, if you're only half-assing your training by not using the fire aspect of your quirk. Shoto glared at him. I refuse to be a hero using his fire. Prowler raised his left brow at the boy. Is that a fact? He asked, sounding more like a drill instructor than a teacher. When the boy nodded, the man's face became furious. Then you leave me no choice. He reached out and grasped the boy by his shirt, hoisting him up from the ground and looking him dead in the eyes. You are expelled from UA. Shoto's eyes went wide. You can't. I can. The man suddenly dropped the boy on his ass. If you won't use all the power at your disposal, then I see no future for you as a hero, he said while the boy looked at him furiously. I will also be recommending that you not be placed in any other hero schools across Japan, considering that they would be wasting their time in attempting to train you, considering that you won't even use your quirk to its fullest potential. Smoke began to rise from Shoto's right side. How dare you? How dare you? Prowler snapped right back at the boy, flames licking at his lips. Have you not seen how hard the rest of your classmates have been working? He demanded as the boy's sleeves began to catch. All of them are doing their best to succeed, but you won't even try to train half as hard as they are. He roared at the boy with a gout of flame spouting from his mouth. How disrespectful can you be? I respect my classmates. Shoto yelled back angrily as he got to his feet. I have nothing but respect for. Then why aren't you willing to show that respect? Prowler asked, his features softening. Shoto, he spoke in a gentler tone, why do you hate your quirk so much? Shoto bit his lip, the flames on his right side dying down. My father. Endeavor, the ex-mercenary nodded. I know him. Fought him once, and nearly knocked his head off. He snorted, remembering the incident almost fondly, and noticed that the boy was also cracking a small smile of his own. So what does your father have to do with this? Shoto's small ghost of a smile quickly disappeared. Do you know about quirk marriages? I do, the man said with some disgust in his voice. I take it that you're a product of one. Shoto nodded in confirmation. He basically bought my mother in order to breed the ultimate hero to surpass All Might since he could never do it himself. He said, my mom used to be the nicest person in the world, and compared to my old man, she was more warm and caring than he could ever hope to be. He shivered, but my dad never paid any attention to what he was doing to her. He neglected my siblings since they didn't have the right quirks, but when I came along, he started training me from the moment I could walk. He shook his head. I wasn't allowed near my siblings because he thought it would make me soft. And he trained me until I could barely stand. The Prowler was listening to the boy, growing angrier by the moment. Mom always tried to reason with him, Shoto continued, but he never listened. He even hit her a few times. His fists clenched, and then, she just broke. She said my right side reminded her of him, and poured boiling water over my face. He reached up and touched the scar over his right eye. After that my old man sent her away to a hospital. I haven't seen her since then. He then looked up at the Prowler. I refuse to use his fire, and I want to become a hero just using my mom's ice. The Prowler sighed. I get that you want your father to pay, he said, wanting nothing more than to deck the number 2 hero for his crimes against the boy, but you're looking at this all wrong, kid. The boy looked at him and the Prowler pointed at him. What is your name? Shoto frowned. I'm Shoto Todoroki, he said, not really understanding why he would ask him such a question. Right, the man nodded. You are Shoto Todoroki, he said with a smile. You are not Enji Todoroki. Shoto frowned again. And your quirk is half hot, half cold, and not Hellflame, is it not? Again, the boy nodded in affirmation. Yes, but I still don't. Your quirk and your father's quirk are 2 separate quirks, Todoroki. The Prowler told the boy, you are not using his flames when you use your right side, you are using your flames. He pointed at his chest, and the best revenge you can have against your father, he smiled, is showing him that you are capable of using your quirk without him having to teach you anything. But the boy started, but clamped his mouth shut. It was true, his father often referred to him as his masterpiece, his creation. His way to finally defeat All Might as the number 1 hero in Japan. But I haven't even used my flames since I was little. For a moment, the Prowler stopped being a teacher, and returned to being Hisashi Midoriya. He reached out and placed his hand on his shoulder. I think I can help with that, he smiled at the boy, if you're willing to try, that is. Shoto looked at him. I thought you were expelling me. Only if you couldn't see that your potential was being wasted. He shook his head. At the moment, there are 3 students in your class that are extremely powerful, and almost ready for pro hero work right now. He said with a small grimace. One of them, and I can't believe the words are coming out of my mouth, is Katsuki Bakugo, he said begrudgingly. Another is my own son, but he still needs a little work. He chuckled as he looked at the boy, and the other is you, young man. Shoto began to smile just a little. I think I'd like to try. Meanwhile, Toshinori had been on edge for the past 2 days since the raid had, supposedly, taken place right on schedule. However, he had yet to hear anything from Sir Night-Eye on the matter, nor had he seen anything on the news regarding a large-scale movement against any large crime organizations. The whole thing had him worried for more reasons than he cared to count. Chief among them being that he wanted his young friend and student to be free of the ruffians that had been terrorizing him and his newly formed family. As such, he was at his desk in the teacher's lounge, staring down at his cell phone in hopes that it would ring. He was barely paying any attention to anything else when someone came into the room, and took notice of the serious look on the skeletal man's face. "I'd hate to know what that poor phone did to make you look at it like that." Startled, Toshinori jumped up clutching at his chest as he saw Hisashi Midoriya half smirking at him while leaning against the doorframe. "Oh. Mr. Midoriya." He sighed in relief. "You scared me half to death." He began to chuckle. "Best to not do that very often, my friend. I am in my 50s after all." The armored groundskeeper teacher chuckled as he took a few steps into the room. "I think my son would be very put off if I gave one of his favorite people a heart attack," he said jokingly. "But what has you looking so focused, Mr. Yagi?" he asked as he went over to the coffee pot. "I've seen that look on heroes' faces when they're about to go into battle." Toshinori retook his seat with a heavy sigh. "In truth, I'm waiting for a call from Sir Night-Eye," he told the man as he poured himself a cup while gestured with the pot to see if the blond man wanted some for himself. "Ah, yes, thank you," he said as the man poured him a cup. "Though I must warn you, Snipe made that pot, and he likes it cowboy strong." He laughed as Hisashi grinned. "I like it kind of strong myself," he admitted. "All that time on the run, you learn to appreciate what you can get." He took a sip of his coffee, making a face, even if it happens to be a cup of tar coffee. Toshinori laughed at the man while he added a copious amount of cream and sugar to both cups before bringing them over. "I can relate on some level," he said as he accepted the cup, "though I'm quite happy that you're able to enjoy the more refined things in life again." Hisashi toasted him with his cup. "And I thank you for that every day I can wake up next to my wife." He smiled. "You mentioned that you were waiting on a call from Night-Eye." "Ah, yes." The man frowned with a glance down at his phone. "Truth be known, it's the reason that All Might wasn't here during the USJ incident." Hisashi raised his brow at him. "Hadn't you heard? He and Night-Eye are going after the group that's been after Little Eri." Hisashi's eyes narrowed. "It's news to me, but if that's the case then I can't really fault him for not being here." He lifted his left shoulder in a half shrug. "Besides, it's mostly thanks to him that I'm teaching the kids full-time right now. I truly am sorry that he's forced this task on you, Mr. Midoriya." Toshinori sighed. "I'm sure you'd rather be spending that precious time with your family instead of teaching the other students." The man just chuckled before seating himself on the end of the desk. "I'm not as bothered by it as I thought I would be," he said truthfully. "I get to see my son, and coach him in his training, and I get to see Inko at the end of the day, or when I have to drag one of the kids to the nurse's offices if it's her turn for a shift." He sighed. "Besides that, I'm finally doing something good with my skills." "How's that going, by the way?" Toshinori asked, curious to know how the students were doing with the man's training regime. "Any progress?" Hisashi nodded. "Quite a bit, and it's only been a few days." He smiled, pleased with the way things had improved. "I think the audience will be in for quite a surprise once the sports festival starts. I heard that young Hagakure can fly." "Now," Toshinori chuckled, "that's something of a grand achievement, I should think." The ex-mercenary shrugged again. "It was, if I'm being honest. But we hit a huge snag when it came to Miss Uraraka and Kaminari." He sighed while Toshinori seemed to be listening with rapt attention. "You probably know this already, but Uraraka suffers from extreme motion sickness if she overuses her quirk," he said, pointing up to his scarred face. "Much like how I suffer from my own quirk, though it's far from as extreme as my own drawbacks. She got violently sick as soon as she used her quirk on herself." Toshinori leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms and cupping his chin in thought. "That does pose a problem," he said, "but there are ways around it, I'm sure." He gave the man a small look. "You might speak with Aizawa about helping her with that little hiccup." Hisashi frowned. "He and we don't get along that great," he said with a sigh. "You know he's been keeping an eye on me every time I've walked through the halls," he said with a twitch in his left brow. "It's like he expects me to blow a fuse at any given second." "That's just how he is," Toshinori said with a small chuckle. "He'll warm up to you eventually. Besides, he's had nothing but good things to say about you since the USJ took place." Hisashi rolled his eyes. "I find that hard to believe." He took a sip of his coffee. the second roadblock that we've hit with Kaminari's flight capabilities was a near-fatal buildup of electricity. Toshinori looked sufficiently worried. If I hadn't used one of my son's capture tools, Kaminari might have blown himself apart. Toshinori dragged his palm down his face. Dear Lord, he sighed, I hope the boy was all right afterward. Shaken, but relatively unharmed, he sighed, I heard him and my son talking it over when they left the gym earlier, so maybe they'll come up with something that I couldn't figure out. He chuckled and raised his cup. That boy's much more knowledgeable than I am when it comes to quirks. Before Toshinori could comment, his phone began blaring out. A phone call is here. A phone call is here. The man nearly dropped his coffee as he scrambled to answer while Hisashi was bent over in laughter at the ridiculous All Might ringtone. God, that's awful, he chortled. Night-eye, Toshinori shouted into the speaker, silencing the man's laughter almost immediately. Thank heaven you finally called. Toshinori sounded so relieved to finally be hearing from his friend. Hisashi made a gesture to put it on speaker. Mirai, mind if I put you on speakerphone? Young Midoriya's father wants to hear about the case. He must have agreed because the blonde took the phone away from his ear and pressed the speaker button. Can you both hear me all right? Sir Night-Eye's voice droned. Loud and clear, Hisashi answered. Good, then I'll get right to the point. Night-Eye went on. The raid was conducted right on schedule, and went off without much resistance from the Yakuza's underlings. He said. Toshinori sighed. That's good, then. Hisashi shook his head. Hold it, Yagi, I think I hear a bit coming. Indeed, Night-Eye continued, while we were able to arrest many of the lesser members of the group, the further into the compound we delved, the more we realized that Shisaki had cleaned the house. Toshinori groaned. Yes, it is as you fear. They've gone to ground. Night-Eye said, frustration evident in his voice, I know not how, but they must have gotten wind that we were coming for them, and that means that Shisaki has packed up and fled with his best men elsewhere. Hisashi pinched his brow. Do you have any clues as to where? Many of the top members of this group are easily recognizable, Night-Eye went on, and as it so happens, several members were seen boarding various flights out of the country, none of them going to the same place in order to confuse authorities as to their final whereabouts. Toshinori was cursing richly while Hisashi thought, if these guys are trying to make a quirk erasing bullet using Eri, then... A thought suddenly struck him as he looked down at the phone. Night-Eye, I have a hunch. At this point I would take anything. The detective said. Try Othen, he said, causing Toshinori to look at him strangely. These guys hate quirks, so that means they'll likely look for like-minded people to help them in their cause. He explained, and Othen is known as a country that has a high amount of humorized supporters. Toshinori stood. You're onto something. The man crowed. Night-Eye, do you think you can check and see if any of those flights that Shisaki's men landed somewhere that they could transfer to Othen? I'm already on it. The man sounded more excited now as the sound of fingers typing came from the other end of the phone. Mr. Midoriya, you were right, he said while the two men beamed at each other. Each flight was to an area that Shisaki and his men could discreetly transfer to a flight to that country. He said, sounding quite pleased, I will begin to petition for a national warrant to have Shisaki and his men extradited. Hisashi's smile fell. Othen has no extradition. He frowned. I was there for a while, and no one so much as attempted to arrest me when I was out in the open. Toshinori slapped his face. So much for that idea. It was a good one. Hisashi relented to the man. But Othen is largely controlled by Humorize, and if they've met up with Shisaki and his men, then there's little chance that we could get at them without a major operation. Toshinori was thoughtful for a moment. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea, he suggested while the man looked at him and Night-Eye was quiet for a long moment. Toshinori, I think you had better enlighten us, Night-Eye suggested. What do you have in mind? Toshinori smiled. A worldwide mission to bring both of these organizations down. He said with a look toward the phone, but that will take some time. He relented. However, can we safely say that young Midoriya and his family are no longer in danger? Night-Eye seemed to think for a moment. I would say that they are no longer in danger, yet I would also go as far as to say that they are in peril. He said, confusing to two men. What's the difference? Hisashi asked. It means that, while the true danger is not an immediate concern for the boy and his family, They are in peril from Shisaki's underlings that will have likely stayed behind in order to keep tabs on the girl, and possibly abduct her if they saw the opportunity. Night Eye explained, but if you're asking me whether you need to keep them from going out and enjoying themselves, then I would have to say that is not necessary. I'm quite certain that the young man can take care of himself, not to say anything about the girl he seems to be dating. Toshinori hooted out a laugh. Oh, young Jiro is more than capable of taking care of herself, and her family. He laughed and smiled at the ex-mercenary. They'll be thrilled. We'll probably still need to live on campus, but Inko would love to go back to work. Hisashi smiled, if she doesn't want to keep helping with recovery girls' work. Night Eye cleared his throat. Now wait a moment, gentlemen, he said, regaining their attention. There's reason to celebrate, but let's not be fools and let our guards down completely. He reminded them, who can say if these lesser individuals will only target the girl? They may yet target the Midoriya and Jiro families to get to her if all else fails. Hisashi smacked his forehead. Damn it, and I was hoping for a small return to normalcy. Toshinori shrugged. At least the children don't have to remain cooped up at the school anymore, he said. I'm willing to bet that your boy and young Jiro would like nothing more than to have their first date, or take little Eri on an outing. I would recommend them having an escort, Night Eye said, a hero that can tail them without getting in their way while keeping an eye out for any trouble. Meanwhile with the 1A girls. Suyu mumbled as she held a dress up in front of her. Mina, I don't think pink is my color, hero. She said as she laid the dress down on her bed. What's wrong with something casual? Mina, along with the rest of the girls in their class, was in the middle of helping the frog girl get ready for her date with Shinso. When she had heard that another one of her classmates had been asked out on a date, the girl had gone into romantic overdrive. Which meant, essentially, that she had all the girls in a tizzy over their friend, who was now at their mercy. Oh, come on, Sue, the pink girl whined, this is your first date. She pointed at the pile of clothes that was stacked up on the bed, all of which had been made by their resident 3D printer, Momo. And you want this guy coming back for more, don't you? Suyu gained a small blush on her face. Well, yeah, I do, but... Then you'd better be ready to knock his socks off, Toru chimed in with a huge grin on her face. Kyoka, who was helping the girl with her hair, just sighed. Come on, guys, it's not that important, she said, gaining looks of disbelief from the two romantics. I mean, Greenie and I haven't been out on a date since we made things official. And that's a criminal offense, right there. Mina suddenly cried, you and Midori make such a cute couple, but you guys haven't even gone out on a date, yet. Ochako suddenly giggled, yeah, but that hasn't stopped them from getting pretty steamy, she said, reminding them all of the incident with Iida barging in on them in the middle of a makeout session. What I mean is, Kyoka snapped out while the others, including Suyu, laughed. If things are meant to work out, then they will, she said while running a brush over Suyu's hair. I mean, this whole thing kind of came out of the right field, didn't it? The girl in front of her gave a small shrug. Well, I certainly didn't expect it, hero, she mumbled. I always figured that if someone took an interest in me romantically, it'd be another heteromorph like me, hero, she croaked while the other girls frowned at her. What I mean is, I'm not as pretty as the rest of guys. Momo suddenly stood up and placed her hands on her hips with a huge huff. That is most certainly not true, Sue. She clearly sounded outraged. Yeah, you're cute as hell. Kyoka added, frowning, honestly I think you're all prettier than me. Toru pointed at her with a pout. Now don't you start, too. Kyoka giggled. I know, and I'm not, she said, continuing to brush her friend's hair. But there was a time when I thought Izuku might look at one of you guys, and realize that he could do better. She said while Suyu turned to her with a bewildered look on her face. What I mean is, we're all the same age, but when I stand next to you guys, I see where my body falls short. She gestured to her chest, and also to her butt. You guys, on the other hand, all look like you could be in Uebami's next big fashion magazine. Momo looked at her with a flat stare. Oh, please, don't tell me you're jealous of these. She pointed to her B********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** after a long day training. Or how much they can get in the way. Ochako chimed in, "My costume is so tight, I feel like I'm suffocating when I tuck mine in. She complained, her face red with embarrassment while the others cracked up, recalling how much trouble the girl had when trying to squeeze into the thing. Toru giggled happily. Thank goodness May took my measurements before making my costume. The girl sighed, but I had a pretty hard time when I just ran around naked. Honey, anyone would, Mina giggled, I'm just surprised you never got caught on anything. She then looked over at Kyoka as she helped the frog girl into a striped green and white dress, but I can kind of see what you're talking about, Kyo. She gestured to herself. When my quirk came in, my skin wasn't pink, I looked. Well, normal I guess. She shook her head. Anyway, when my quirk came in, my skin turned the nastiest shade of gray you could imagine. She held out her left arm, gesturing to her skin. It took 2 years for it to turn to this color. She then pointed at her hair, and my hair was blonde, not pink to start with, blonde. She shivered, and because of my quirk, all my hair fell out. The girls gasped loudly. Lucky for me it grew back pretty quick, but it was nowhere near what it was like before, she said, making a dismissive gesture. I like the way I looked before my acid quirk turned my skin and hair pink, or my horns grew in. You didn't have them before? Ochako asked curiously. Mina shook her head. Nope, she said, popping the pea. They grew in a few months after my skin started changing. She leveled a look at the other girls, and let me tell you, when I think back and compare the two, it was worse than my first period when these things grew in. I find that hard to believe. Kyoka shivered. Mina huffed. You better believe it. She said, arms crossed under her chest, because I had the worst headache for the longest time when they started growing. She pointed up and touched the tip of one of the horns, and to add insult to injury, they had velvet on them. She gave them all a disgusted look. Do you know what that means? She asked, and the girls shook their heads. It means that when they grew in fully, that velvet started coming off in bloody strips that had me screaming in the wee hours of the morning and scaring my parents and my neighbors half to death. She sighed, and before I got used to being my big bad pink self, I got some of the worst teasing you can imagine. Oh, dear, Momo said, how horrible. I can only imagine what that must have been like. Mina giggled. Yeah, it was pretty bad, she said, and patted her stomach. Another thing that made it worse was that I was a kind of chunky monkey as a kid. Suyu turned to her. You're not saying they called you fat, Hiro? Mina had a wide grin on her face. Oh, they called me way worse than fat, honey, she giggled, shrugging, but I put up with it. She then flexed her arms, because when I finally started to really grow, I trimmed out, got super tall, and I started dancing to get myself into real killer shape. Then, much to Kyoka's embarrassment, she raised both hands up under her *****************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************�̈ tell you, I never saw such a turn around in my entire life until I went from a washboard chest to a C cup. Creepers, Toru frowned. Mina nodded at her statement. You got that right, honey. 'Cause when I started looking less blah and more fine, the boys, and a few girls couldn't keep their hands off me. She laughed, leaning herself back toward the wall. But having a nice body doesn't guarantee what you have, sweetie, she said while looking at Kyoka. I've said it before, but Midori's probably the sweetest guy in our class, and has a really bright future as a hero. Kyoka sniffed and turned her nose up at her haughtily. You can't have him. Mina rose with a devilish look. Oh, you have no idea how much I wanna steal him. She giggled, looking around the room. I mean, no judgment, but who here had an insta-crush on our little spider babe? Unashamedly, Toru raised her hand, her tongue stuck out in a silly manner. Guilty. She giggled. Sorry, Kyoka. Kyoka just rolled her eyes but was shocked at who raised their hand next. Really, Yaomomo? She asked with a laugh at her friend while the pampered rich girl blushed as red as her hero costume. Well, the girl coughed into her hand. He is rather adorable. Toru giggled hysterically. Yeah, especially when he starts stuttering. The girl giggled. Are we seriously talking about all the things you guys find attractive about my boyfriend? Kyoka laughed in exasperation. I'm not giving him up, and I am so not sharing. Suyu piped up. Ah, but that could be fun, Hiro. Kyoka sputtered and started laughing wildly. She had to lean on the frog girl to keep her balance before she turned to Ochako. Okay, Oh-chan, might as well fess up, she said to the giggling brunette. Did you have a crush on him, too? Ochako giggled, hiding her face in her hands whilst activating her quirk. The girls erupted into more laughter as the girl started floating around Suyu's room. FYI, I'm taking that as a yes. Kyoka called up to her as she bounced off the ceiling. He saved my life during the entrance exams. Ochako defended herself with a wild blush across her face. How could I not have a tiny crush on him? Toru and Mina were cracking up. Yes. Mina giggled. Come on down and join the cinnamon roll harem. She laughed, causing Momo to start sputtering again. Not on your life, Kyoka told the pink girl, brandishing the hair brush like a cudgel. Take one step toward my man and it is so on, Pinky. She half threatened, half laughed while Mina fell over from her laughter and Toru was holding her stomach. Ochako giggled as Suyu reached out to pull her back down with her tongue so she wouldn't have a hard landing when she deactivated her quirk. You don't have to worry about me, Kyoka, she giggled before looking more embarrassed than before. I kind of want to focus on becoming a hero before even thinking about romance. Mina sat up, looking disappointed. Well, that's no fun. She huffed. Besides, it's not like it's something you can control, is it? Momo smiled at the brunette. She's right, dear, the heiress said. You may just walk into class one day and find yourself head over heels for someone. Ochako grinned at her, like you are for Todoroki. Ooh, Momo covered her face in embarrassment. Was it that obvious? Kyoka giggled, all together now. Yes, the girls all shouted at her. You guys are mean. Momo squealed. Suyu, this is your room, make them behave. Suyu giggled. I think I need to hurry up and get ready, she laughed. Besides, all this noise is probably making the boys nervous. Meanwhile with the 1A boys, Shinso was looking up at the ceiling nervously as he waited down in the common room with his friends. Man, what the heck is going on up there? He wondered out loud while the squeals and laughter from the girls continued. He was leaning against the back of one of the couches with Kirishima and Kaminari sitting behind him. Ah, I wouldn't mind it, Shinbro, the faux redhead smirked at him. They're just having fun while getting Sue ready for your date. He then grinned slyly. Pretty smooth, man, asking her out like that. Shinso shrugged. I just figured that if Midoriya could make something work, then so could I. He said, raising his left hand to scratch his reddening cheeks. Besides, she's incredible. Kaminari groaned. Aw man, why am I the only one with bad luck around here? He bemoaned, hanging his head. First Midoriya, now you. He threw his hands up and grabbed at his head. Who's next? Bakugo, he shouted as said ashen blonde was in the kitchen grabbing a drink from the fridge. Leave me out of this, Pikachu. He roared angrily. Kaminari jumped up. If you're gonna call me Pokemon names, at least use some of the cool ones. The electric blonde shouted. I'd even settle for Electrode. Anything but Pikachu. Shinso looked down at Kirishima. Are they seriously arguing about Pokemon names for Kaminari? He asked incredulously. Kirishima was giving off a weak laugh while holding up his hands. Could be worse, right? What's wrong with Pikachu? Bakugo shouted. He's the cutest one of all. Are you serious? Kaminari shouted back. There's loads cuter than Pikachu. Bullshit. Bakugo roared back. Name one. Kaminari shouted. Bulbasaur. Not even close. Thunderbolt. Kirishima called out. Come on, guys. You stay out of this, shitty hair. Iida suddenly came bounding into the room. What is going on in here? He demanded loudly. I'm trying to study, and all of this noise is making it impossible. Looking toward Shinso. Shinso, what in the world are they shouting about? Shinso jerked his thumb toward the two arguing blondes. Tweedledee and Tweedledum are arguing over which Pokemon is cutest. He said as Iida just gave the boy a blank look. Hey, don't look at me like that. I have no idea why this is happening. I'm just waiting on Asui so we can go on our date. Iida bowed. My apologies, I didn't mean to implicate you, he said before turning to the two arguing blondes. And for your information, it's obvious that the cutest Pokemon in the world is Meryl. Oh hell no, Bakugo yelled. That one's just a Pikachu knockoff. Kaminari yelled. Hiroshima chuckled. Great, now there's 3 of them. He laughed before turning to Shinso. Anyway, where were guys planning to go, anyway? Shinso shrugged. She said she likes movies, he said, so. Hey, that's cool, Hiroshima said, nothing beats a classic, right? Shinso nodded. Yeah, and since it'll be dark in the theater, she won't see how totally nervous I am. He muttered with a proverbial rain cloud hanging over his head. Hiroshima just laughed at that as the doors to their dormitory came open and Izuku came in with Eri sitting on his shoulders. Uncle Baku's being loud again. The little girl giggled as she saw one of her favorite people. That made Bakugo grin. Hey, Squirt, he pointed at Kaminari, who's this? Uncle Pikachu, Eri said without missing a beat. Kaminari hit his knees. No. Anything but that. He was crying rivers of tears now. How'd I say no to her? Ha. Bakugo cackled. You lose, Pikachu. He laughed while Izuku put the little girl down so she could play. She raced over to Bakugo where the ashen blonde slapped a high five. Way to go, Pipsqueak. Yeah, Eri squealed as she slapped his hand. Izuku just laughed at their antics, glad the girl was beginning to come out of her shell more. He walked over to the couch, still waiting for the girls to finish. He asked the brainwashing teen. Shinso nodded. Yeah, but it sounds like World War IV up there, he said before he noticed. Hey, they stopped laughing. He yelped right as the elevator dinged. Oh, I'm so not ready for this. His face then started turning red as he saw his date walk out with the other girls tailing behind her. Izuku chuckled. He knew that feeling. While Suyu wasn't dressed fancily, she did look cute with her hair done up in a French braid. She wore a simple cotton dress with green stripes across the length of it, and simple white sneakers. But from the look on his friend's face, Izuku could tell that Shinso's world had been rocked. Teehee, Mina popped out from behind the girl. I think we can count this as a success, ladies. She pointed at the still stunned Shinso. He's totally drooling. Shinso seemed to snap out of it before raising his arm to hide his mouth. I am not. He muttered, before casting a shy glance at the girl. But, you look really nice, Asui. The girl smiled. Thanks, Hiro. The girl gave a happy croak. You look nice, too. She said before stepping forward and looping her arm through his. So, should we go? Shinso blushed even brighter. Yeah, let's go. The boy mumbled as the two of them walked toward the exit. The verdette chuckled as Kyoka came over to him, smiling from ear to ear. Is that what I used to look like when you teased me? He asked his girlfriend. Kyoka huffed. HMPH, what do you mean used to, green bean? She asked, placing a finger against his chest and tracing it up to his collarbone before she ran it up to his neck and under his chin. I can still make you melt into a blushing, muttering pile of mush. She whispered huskily. Her point was proven as that very thing happened. Mina and Toru were watching the little scene unfold jealously. Man, Mina whined while tucking her arms behind her back. You know I was just kidding about the harem thing, but it still beeps that such a sweet guy got snapped up right off the bat. Toru just patted her on the back. No worries, there's still plenty of guys left, she said with a small smile, or girls if you're into that. Mina giggled as Momo came over and bopped both of them on their heads. All right, you two peeping tomboys, that's enough, she said. We still need to get ready for tomorrow, remember? Ochako groaned at the mention of the training session for Monday. I'm not looking forward to that, she said as she remembered one of the students in Class 1B. That Monoma guy seriously gives me the creeps. Bakugo came over with Eri riding on top of his shoulders while playing with his hair. No worries, the blonde said. If any of those B-list losers give us grief, I'll blow them to the moon. Ochako giggled at that while the other 3 just stared. Am I crazy? Momo asked the pair she was holding onto, or are those 2? Toru shook her head. Nah. Can't be. Mina shook her head while crossing her arms. That's like world-ending stuff right there. Monday. Day 5 of training. When Monday morning arrived, Class 1A was up bright and early to get to Gym Gamma, eager to get back to training. For the first time, they were joined by Shota Aizawa, the underground hero wanting to make sure that the Prowler was doing what was necessary for the class. However, As soon as the armored ex-mercenary gave out instructions for their workouts before training began, the doors to the gym were thrown open. "All right, maggots, fall in," Vlad King roared as his students shuffled in, all of them looking more tired than Class 1A on their first day of training. Both the class representative and vice representative were at the head of the line, and were more than a little stunned to see their sister class already working. Vlad scowled. "Well, don't just stand there," he snapped. "Get in line and catch up." Since Class 1A had started out with push-ups, so did 1B. However, they soon found out that keeping up was next to impossible. Kendo and Tetsu were the only ones that managed to keep up with the other class, both of them being in top physical condition, a fact that the Prowler took notice of. However, the exercises continued on. When 1A finished, they waited for 1B to catch up. It gave them time to catch their breath. Finally, when the students of 1B finished their sets, the Prowler passed out water for all of them. "You've all done well for the first half of training today," he said as he passed the last bottle to Nito Monoma, "but you still have a long way to go." The boy said nothing, knowing that he had been one of the last to finish the exercises. The blonde smiled. "Well, that's to be expected since you've been showing an inferior class favor over us," he said, "though, I guess it's to be expected since your own son is among them." Vlad smacked himself in face. He had attempted to curb the blonde's antagonistic attitude toward the sister class, but he never expected the copy quirk user to target a teacher. "Wipe that smile off your face." The Prowler snapped harshly. "Beating Class 1A, is that your only goal?" He cast his eyes across the entirety of the sister class. "You think it ends there if you manage to come out on top of another class?" He stepped back and stood in front of both of them. "Think about what your life will be like in the next year, or the next 5 or 10 years. He snapped. "If that's all you want, then you won't be going very far." His eyes fell back on the blonde who lowered his head. "If you all claim to want to be heroes, then I won't tolerate you just settling for being the top of your classes. You will all be the best that this school has ever seen. You'll be the best or you'll be nothing." Aizawa frowned. "Hey, take it easy." The Prowler turned to him. "If you have a problem, then leave." The man said, "Nezu has already told me what he wants me to do, and to do what I must to achieve it." He frowned as he made a gesture to Aizawa's students. "If you actually cared, then you'd see that your students have all improved," he said, "and they are ready for the festival now. But it's not just because I offered to train them, it's because they chose to improve. I offered Vlad the opportunity to let his class start early, but he chose to let me start with yours first." Aizawa narrowed his eyes. He didn't like this man's tone. And now his class needs to realize that if they choose to stay in these lessons, it will be harder on them. The Prowler smirked beneath his mask, but taking a harder path often leads to the best results. Aizawa was quiet for a few moments before speaking. "I'll be speaking with Nezu about this." "I don't care," the Prowler said before turning back to the class. "All right, time for quirkless combat." He shouted to the recovering students, "Everyone grab a power-dampening cuff, and line up by classes." Each student was paired up with a member of the opposing class for quirkless combat, Class 1B seeing just how much they needed to improve during that first 4 hours of absolute hell. Vlad felt that the Spartan tactics were doing his class a world of good. What was more, he approved of how he handled the students. Aizawa, however, was watching with a critical eye over his own class. Particularly Shinso. The lanky boy had changed within the 4 days since the Prowler began teaching them. Shinso had now gained much-needed muscle mass in his chest and arms, and he was now a decent fighter. And that was taking into consideration that he was paired with Tetsu. "All right, Shinso, keep those limbs close and tight," Prowler ordered as the two teens faced each other. Tetsu, show me what you've got." "Yes sir," Shinso answered. "You got it." Tetsu grinned. With that, the Prowler rang the bell, and the match began. To no one's surprise, Tetsu attacked first, going in for a wild haymaker. Shinso ducked, and drove a right straight into the other teen's gut. By no means a powerful blow, but enough to give the sharp-toothed teen second thoughts about rushing in. Still, Tetsu persisted, throwing punch after punch, but the smaller-framed Shinso was able to bob in and out of his reach easily. And in between those dodges, he got in a few good hits. Tetsu decided it was time to end it while he was still in good shape, and went in for a right overhand punch. Shinso just barely managed to move in time, receiving a cut along his left cheek, before letting loose with a right uppercut straight to Tetsu's chin. He winced as he felt his knuckles crack when he connected. It wasn't enough to knock the metal-eating teen down for good, but it did rattle him. He staggered back, his eyes unfocused, giving Shinso his chance to move in. He jumped up, scissor sweeping Tetsu to the mat. He then took a card from Izuku's deck, and grabbed his left leg in a knee bar. Tetsu was howling in seconds. "Arg, out," he roared. Vlad groaned as the prowler rang the bell 3 times, signifying the end of the match. "Not bad, boys, not bad at all," the former mercenary said as Shinso released Tetsu. "Shinso, I see a lot of improvement with your movements," he said before addressing Tetsu, "and you, young man, are a powerhouse, without a doubt," he said as the boy grimaced. "But I lost," the boy muttered. The prowler shrugged. "So what?" he asked. "If you had your quirk, I highly doubt that Shinso could have lasted very long, provided he didn't get you with his own quirk first," he said, gesturing for the boys to step out of the ring. "Now, would anyone like to comment on the fight?" Vlad grumbled. Tetsu relied too much on his fists, he said, making a gesture with his own. "Fights out in the real world doing hero work are rarely straight-up fist fights," he explained to his confused student. Shinso took advantage of that, and used his legs. Hitoshi just shook his head. "No sir, I was really just flying by the seat of my pants." He wiped a bit of blood off of his cheek where Tetsu had cut him. "No offense, Sato, but he hits way harder than you do." He grinned over at his classmate. The large-lipped teen just grinned. "None taken, Shinso," he laughed. However, Aizawa stepped in. "Your attacks lack power, Shinso, you'll need to work on that." He gestured to his chin. An uppercut to the chin is normally a good way to knock your opponent out cleanly. However, while you managed to stun your opponent, you should have been able to score a knockout. The prowler nodded to both teachers. "Good points on both fronts, gentlemen," he said. Tetsu, starting today, you'll be learning other techniques other than punches. Use your entire body, your arms, legs, all of it. Observe the other students when their matches come up, particularly Midoriya or Jiro, as both of them are grapplers, and Jiro is more prone to using strong kicks and backhands rather than punches. He then looked toward Shinso. "Shinso, I want you on the sandbags. Put on some arm weights, and start punching until we start quirk training." Shinso nodded. "Yes, sir." He moved off toward one of the hanging bags near the walls. Tetsu just frowned. "Just one round," he grumbled. "Ah, come on, that barely got my blood pumping." Vlad smacked his head. "Keep it up, and I'll step into the ring with you," he growled. "Now sit down and watch while we start the next round." "All right, next," the prowler roared. "Bakugo, I see you go for any low blows like last time, and you'll be doing laps for a month." It was a beeping accident. The ashen blonde snapped as he stepped up for his turn. His opponent was Pony Tsunotori. Mina winced at the matching. "Oof, this is gonna get ugly," she muttered as a few of her classmates nodded. Kendo heard her and giggled. "Oh, I wouldn't worry that much about Pony," she said in a hushed tone. "She may be a cutie, but she knows how to fight." Bakugo didn't look all that enthused as the girl clumsily entered the ring. "Just great," he muttered. "Why couldn't I get one of the real threats?" he said before dropping into his usual stance. Pony, all the while, kept a smile on her face as she bowed politely. "I hope we have a good match," she said brightly. Bakugo's brow twitched. The bell rang. A few minutes later, laughter ensued from both classes as one Katsuki Bakugo sailed out of the ring from a very strong shoulder throw from a petite, yet deceptively strong, blonde girl. The prowler was whistling with appreciation. "Well, now, that's some fine strength she has, Vlad," he chuckled as Bakugo landed smack dab on his head, his eyes bugging out of his head in astonishment. "I'm impressed." Vlad was nodding with pride as his student seemed to be worried about her opponent. "It's all right, Miss Tsunotori," he said in perfect English to the girl. "Everyone thinks you did very well." She bowed in his direction. Thank you, Mr. Vlad. Class 1A was howling with laughter as Kaminari and Kirishima rushed over to the stunned blonde. Yo, Bakubro. Kirishima laughed as they reached him. Guess what? You got knocked the beeping out. Kaminari belted out laughing. Katsuki's eyes came back into focus for a moment as he glared at them. Oh, screw both of you. He snapped before tumbling to his feet. I want a rematch. Not today, the Prowler called out with an amused tone as the two boys grabbed the ashen blonde and Frog marched him back to the group. Now, would someone please tell me what Bakugo did wrong? Kyoka's hand shot up. He underestimated his opponent, she said with a grin on her face, and because of that, he got served. Bite me, ears. Kyoka pointed to her boyfriend, intent on teasing both of them. He's the only one I bite, bomb brain. Izuku's face lit up like a Christmas tree. Mina was grinning impishly at them. Yeah, we know, honey, because I've had to help cover up some of the bites he's left on you. She giggled while Kyoka went red herself. All right, that's enough, the Prowler called out as the three boys rejoined them. Bakugo, she did have a fine point, he said as the boy grimaced. He jerked his thumb at the horned girl. Never, ever underestimate your opponent, no matter what he or she may look like. Bakugo said nothing as the day continued on in a similar manner. The quirkless combat training proved to both classes that neither was to be underestimated. Izuku found his opponent, who turned out to be Kendo, to be far more effective than he was when it came to hand-to-hand combat, as he was soon on his back and tapping out. Kyoka wasn't as unlucky when she faced a girl named Kanoko Komori, a timid girl that resembled Ochako Uraraka, and had her tapping out with the first strike. When it came time for quirk training, the Prowler set Class 1A up for their usual routine in strengthening their quirks. Come on, I want to see sparks flying. The Prowler snapped. Tetsu Tetsu. Kirishima, move those limbs faster. He snapped at the two near-identical teens. You have to be faster in your hardened forms. Yes, sir. Both shouted out as they continued to pummel each other. Kirishima, the former mercenary, felt was very close to a breakthrough with his quirk. A fact which pleased him as both of them had great potential for defensive and offensive combat. But the one he was most interested in seeing grow was the class, Big Sister. Kendo Itsuka, as his son had voiced his suspicion, could do so much more than what she thought. However, he was waiting on confirmation from the principal before trying out his son's theory. Hagakure, he shouted out above the classes, don't get so high off the ground. He admonished as the girl practically surfed over his head on an invisible shield. If you lose control, I don't want you getting injured. The girl squealed with absolute glee as she surfed down beside him. That is the best feeling in the world. She giggled as her feet touched the ground, giddy from her success. The Prowler chuckled. Don't get cocky, kid. He reached out and ruffled her hair, prompting more giggles. Try using those light punches you told me about on the punching bags for a while, all right? Okay, teach. She bounded off toward the punching bags. He then turned toward his other potential flyers. Uraraka, how's it going? He asked of the now green-faced girl as she attempted to keep the contents of her stomach down. No luck, huh? The girl leaned over on her knees, heaving in and out. No, sir, she groaned pitifully. I just can't get it right. Hey, now, the man said, crouching down. Don't give in just yet, he told her. There's no such thing as a dead end, you just need to find a different way to go about it. He stood. Now, how are you trying to make this work? Ochako sat down on the floor to catch her breath. Well, She raised her hands, looking down at the little pads on her fingers. I've been touching my fingers together to activate my quirk. She mimed bringing her fingers together, and when I bring them apart, I try to spread my quirk all over. The Prowler thought for a moment. Have you tried keeping your fingers together, and then controlling your quirk? The girl shook her head. All right then, catch your breath, and then we'll try that. It took a couple of minutes to get her stomach back to normal, but the girl was ready to try again. When she placed her fingers together, her quirk activating, the Prowler coached her. All right, now keep your eyes closed while we do this, he instructed, the girl nodding as she closed her eyes. Now, imagine the aura of your quirk spreading out from your hands and over you. He told her. In Ochako's mind, she imagined a faint pink glow emanating from the little pads on her fingers, spreading out and outlining her hands, her arms, her shoulders, and then her body. The Prowler smiled beneath his mask as the glow surrounded the girl. "Good, now, will that power to lift you from the ground," he said, "don't let it fight you. Push it to do what you want it to do." Nearby the students and the two teachers took notice of something. A bright, pink glow, like an aura of power surrounding the brunette. For a moment, nothing happened, and a very hopeful Toru feared that her friend wouldn't be joining her in the skies anytime soon, but then the girl slowly began to rise and the aura around her grew to an almost flame-like appearance. Ochako, for her part, knew that she was beginning to float. She let her fingers drift apart, still willing herself to go higher. And she did. Even when she felt her arms fall down to her sides, she felt herself rising higher. "It's not enough," she thought, an image of two people coming to her mind. "I have to do more, for them." Her eyes snapped open, her sclera turning the same pink as the aura around her. She looked down and saw the former mercenary staring at her. "Think you can move yourself over to where Aizawa is standing?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward the scruffy teacher. She could almost make out the huge grin on his face beneath his mask. She looked over to where her homeroom teacher was standing, his eyes slightly wider than usual. She tilted her body, and flew. "Excellent," the Prowler said as the combined classes erupted into applause. "Excellent work, Miss Uraraka." He disengaged his mask, showing his positively beaming smile on his face. "Now, bring yourself down right next to him." Slowly, Aizawa cautioned, worried that her quirk would be too taxing on her. Ochako gained a bit of speed, however, and smiled as she angled herself down toward him. She then showed off a little by flipping forward and landing lightly on her toes, before promptly turning as green as bell pepper. "We need a bucket over here," Vlad hollered as Momo pelted toward the girl, a pail coming out of her stomach. She tossed it to Aizawa, who caught it just in time as he thrust it at the girl and she vomited into it. Despite the fact that she was still retching, most of the classes came forward to congratulate the girl on her success. "Hey, don't crowd her," yelled a certain ashen blonde, "you're gonna make it beeping worse." Katsuki yelled, who had somehow plowed through the crowd of students and was rubbing the girl's back. The Prowler had to bite his tongue to keep from making a comment on how protective he was being, and how appreciative Uraraka looked as he rubbed between her shoulders. "He's right, everyone," Vlad shouted, "as pleased as I am to see one of our students advancing in their training," he said with a smile down at the brunette. "The rest of you all need to catch up to Miss Uraraka. Now get back to work," he roared, scattering the students back to their respective areas. All but Bakugo and Uraraka. He smirked and gave out a small sigh. "Bakugo, would you mind escorting Miss Uraraka to the infirmary?" he said while the boy gave him a look. "I'd like to make sure that this new aspect of her quirk hasn't had any lasting effects." Bakugo, for once, didn't argue as he helped the girl to her feet before she stumbled a little, prompting the team to pick her up, bridal style. A sight that had girls from both Class 1A and 1B cooing loudly while a very flustered and nauseous Ochako Uraraka protested. Aizawa gave the man a look. "You're supposed to be teaching these children," he said with a hardened tone, "not playing the matchmaker." Hisashi shrugged before putting his helmet back down. "Matchmaker my ass," he said before moving off toward Kaminari. Those two already had the hots for each other. "Besides, my concerns were valid and Bakugo is further along than most of the other students aside from my son and Todoroki." He then barked out, "Has anyone seen Midoriya?" Said boy suddenly appeared right next to him, right here. He all but chirped, scaring his father. Principal's office. Several hours later. Nezu had expected some form of backlash from his staff after the first official day of the special training course in preparation for the sports festival. However, he wasn't expecting such mixed signals. While on one hand he had Vlad King praising the Prowler and his Spartan tactics, boasting that he was already seeing results from his own students after a single session. On the other hand he had Eraserhead calling for the immediate termination of the program. His tactics are not only irrational to a fault, but he blatantly disregards the safety of the students during quirkless combat. The man stated heatedly, one of my students was injured, and has yet to see recovery girl over the matter. Nezu smiled at him patiently. If you're referring to Mr. Shinso, I've already addressed the matter with the young man himself, he said, picking up a slip of paper that had the boy's statement on it. He says, and I quote, "It's just a crack in my knuckles, and not even a full fracturing. If I let something like this bother me, then I won't get far in the hero business." End quote. Nezu said while the man fumed, "I realize that you prefer your own methods, Aizawa, but you have to realize something. Hisashi Midoriya is doing exactly as I asked him to do." "Which is what, exactly?" the underground hero demanded. "These children are going to be at this school for 3 years if they can cut it, so why is it that you feel the need to resort to such brutal tactics so early on?" Nezu leveled a black-eyed stare at the man. "I have several, and none of them are trivial," he said. "The first and foremost reason is that these children were attacked, some of them very nearly killed, in a villain assault on this school." He let a hint of bitterness creep into his voice. "My school, Aizawa," he reminded him, "is meant to be a safe haven for young people seeking to be heroes. It is our job, above teaching them, to see that no harm comes to them from outside of this school, and let us face the facts, they will come to harm from our own hands, as training the next generation of heroes is no easy task." "And the other reasons?" Aizawa asked. "The first, while I'll admit is unacceptable, is a valid reason, but not enough in my books to be rational." "Rational, Mr. Aizawa?" The rodent seemed to bristle. "Rational would mean that these children could attend here without having to worry about psychotic, murderous heathens marching into this school in order to kidnap a tiny child smaller than I am," he growled. "Rational would mean that disgusting creatures such as that maniacal doctor and those humanoid arachnids did not exist." He then shook his head. No, Mr. Aizawa, we are well beyond the point of anything rational," he said. "My school was not only attacked, and my students physically, emotionally, and mentally assaulted, but they were also violated as I once was when it was discovered that I, an animal, was more intelligent most humans can hope to be in today's age." He gave the man a hard glare. "So if you would like to have things return to the way they once were before this school was assaulted, then you will have to do better than this, because I will not have my students caught unawares again, nor will I tolerate another villain coming here to harm, or heaven forbid, kill one of my teachers, or my students. And I believe that the only reason that you are upset over this matter," the rodent continued, "is because you don't care for Hisashi Midoriya as a whole." Aizawa frowned. "That is one part of it," he admitted. "I have no problems with him as a person, but as a former vigilante, and a mercenary, I can't trust him." He looked at the principal. "You didn't see what I saw, Nezu. He held nothing back when the assault began. He's too willing to kill. And you're afraid that he's projecting that willingness to kill onto the students," Nezu reasoned with a shake of his head. "While it is true that he can be a force to be reckoned with, I assure you that using lethal force is the furthest thing from his mind. As you should know, I asked the man to give a lecture on the subject," he reminded the teacher. "You were in attendance, after all." Before the man could go any further, Nezu stopped him. "Did it cross your mind that, even for a single second, that Miss Hagakuri or Miss Uraraka could use their quirks to attain a form of flight?" he asked, and when the man didn't answer her continued, "Granted, he uses unorthodox methods, but he does get results, and that mentality he has to push beyond natural limits is exactly what this school is all about." He went on. 2 out of 3 students that he has began coaching into flight have achieved that goal. The only one that has not is Mr. Kaminari, who seems to be making some progress, given that he is able to produce more voltage without shocking himself senseless." Aizawa was quiet for a long moment before he rose and stalked toward the door. "The moment he screws up, don't come crying to me." "I wouldn't dream of it," Nezu said as the man threw the door open, and, lo and behold, the very subject of their conversation was preparing to knock. "Ah, Mr. Midoriya, a perfectly timed entrance," he said as Aizawa gave the man a glare, and stalked past him. Hisashi gave the man a wide berth. "I do try," he muttered as Aizawa stalked into the halls. "I take it that he's been having a go at me." Nezu shrugged. "Nothing that you need to worry about," he assured him as the man came in. "Please, have a seat. Shall I brew some tea?" Hisashi shook his head. "As much as I could use a good brew, Nezu, I think we should get to the meat of things," he sighed. "This being the first official day, I thought I'd give you a progress report on the last few days as well as today's training. Nezu gave a small shake of his head. Appreciated, but unnecessary, he told the man who raised his brow at him. I've been keeping watch through the gym's security cameras, you see. He explained. Hisashi nodded in understanding. Good call, he said. Perfect way to keep an eye on a hazy bet like me. Oh, you misunderstand, Mr. Midoriya, Nezu said immediately. I use the cameras across the entire campus to keep an eye on not only my students, but also my teachers, he said. You see, there was a small scandal with a former teacher here involving a student. He went on. Needless to say that neither that teacher, nor the student went much further than this school. Hisashi chuckled, making a mental note to never get on the furball's bad side. Again, completely understandable, he said, though, I do hope you keep those cameras out of inappropriate places, such as the dorms. Worry not, I respect the privacy of all students and teachers, and keep my cameras strictly to areas such as the lounges, classrooms, and training grounds, he said, though the perimeter defenses could do with a few more upgrades. Back on topic, Hisashi said, I assume you know about Endeavor's boy. Nezu's beady little eyes narrowed. If you are referring to the fact that he has suffered abuse from his father, then yes, I am. Hisashi nodded. All right, then is there anything that you can do about it? To the man's displeasure, Nezu shook his head. I'm afraid not. He said, Endeavor has had such claims leveled against him several times, and he now has some of the best lawyers in and out of the country on his payroll. He sighed. As much as I would like to help the boy legally, I'm afraid that UA's lawyers can only do so much, and we would still end up losing. Hisashi sighed, running his hand through his hair. That makes my job a bit less gratifying, he muttered. I came close to killing Endeavor a few years ago. Saddens me now that I didn't. He frowned, tapping his chin in thought. His son is certainly something special, and I think that he could take his powers even further if pushed to their absolute limits, but I'm not sure that I can do it safely, though it would be the perfect punch to his pompous father's face. He chuckled. Nezu sighed. I am reluctant to endanger the students, yet I know that I asked you to do what you thought was necessary, he said, but do bring it up with the boy, and if he is willing to try, then we will speak more on how to proceed. Hisashi sighed. I can work with that, he nodded. Next, we have Kaminari. Ah, yes, our resident joker, the rodent chuckled. How is he doing after that incident last week? The man took a deep breath. Not bad, but not good, either, I'm afraid. He shook his head in frustration. We're close to a breakthrough here, Nezu, I can feel it. He sighed, but something's bothering him, and whatever it is, it's holding the kid back. He crossed his arms. Does the kid have any bad history we need to know about? Nezu shook his head. Not to my knowledge, no, he said. He is, however, related to a well-known heroine of the past, Spectrum. Hisashi's head shot up. Spectrum. The first real hero. The woman that could change herself into any form of energy, that Spectrum. He asked with slight awe in his voice. The very same, Nezu said with a slow nod. Though the relation is rather distant, he is a direct descendant of hers. He sighed sadly. Files on Spectrum and the use of her powers were very poorly documented given the circumstances of the age they were in at the time. Hisashi frowned. The age in which Spectrum had lived in had been well over 200 years ago, before the first official documented case of quirks, the first being the glowing child, was ever made. At the time, those with quirks were known as mutants, and were ostracized by much of society before they began to rise in frequency. It had been a lawless time where people were terrified of their own neighbors. It wasn't very long before those that were mistreated because of their powers turned to being the first villains. Anarchy had risen, and there was no one that dared to stop the villains that were taking over. And then Spectrum had appeared. She was one of the few that stood up for people, both with and without powers, that were too afraid to fight for themselves. But her acts had not gone unnoticed. Soon, others had joined her in the fight. To learn that one of his students was a descendant of hers. Does he know? Hisashi asked. Again the rodent shook his head. I didn't think it prudent or wise to bring this to his attention since no one in his family has shown that sort of power since Spectrum's fall, he said, though I will say that with the current level of power that Mr. Kaminari has been displaying, I would say that he is the strongest of her line since Spectrum herself. It would have to be a very distant line, wouldn't it? He muttered. He recalled Spectrum being an African-American woman, while Kaminari looked nothing like someone of mixed race. So, we have a potential power plant on our hands, he surmised as the rodent nodded in confirmation. The real question is, how do we help him be that power plant? Nezu sighed. I think you will find that the answer is somewhat troublesome, he said. Do you remember the incident? When he built up too much power? I do. Hisashi nodded. Vividly, are you saying that? When he claims to have felt like he was about to explode, Nezu said with a dark tone, it may have been his quirk trying to move on to the next stage. Hisashi covered his face with his hands, running them down his face, and laced his fingers together. I agreed. To train these kids, Nezu, not kill them. Nezu sighed. I'm not asking you to try, but it is something that you could use as a potential lead. The principal said, Mr. Kaminari's talents, as they are more than enough to make him into a fine hero. However, I feel that he wants more. However, Spectrum also used her emotions as catalysts at times, so maybe find out what is bothering him first. I would rather do that than send him into a suicide run. Hisashi nodded. I'll speak with him tonight, after we're done here, but I'd like to request some help from the Big Three tomorrow for some higher level combat training. Nezu nodded slowly. I'll make the request when we finish here, he said as the man rose, and Hisashi. The man paused as he turned for the door. I wish you luck. Hisashi sighed. Save it for the kids. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.